This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people have so much to gain and have such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. They'll never let the true facts come of their boards to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember the name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, yeah. Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 205. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we are back to wrap up this kind of winding conversation that we've had over the last couple episodes. This is probably 3 of 3 of, I guess, what is becoming sort of our meta parapolitics trilogy.
Yes.
If I dare to create such a term of meta parapolitics, but or talking about the meta of parapolitics, I guess.
Yeah, I feel like it's a bit of a meta episode and a parapolitics episode because, again, like we've been saying, we don't want to like over-identify with the concept of parapolitics. Like, I didn't even think of it necessarily as meta. I mean, I'm the one who suggested this, that we talk about the history of the term parapolitics, just because it's a term you hear all the time. I didn't think that it would be like a meta episode, but then we're like, well, all right, let's like do some like meta stuff as well, because like I feel like often we're like put under that umbrella. And while I think like some of the stuff we looked at is interesting, again, I feel like, it comes back to what I was saying last time about like this book that we're going to look at, as we kind of finish Government of Shadows, it's called. It's like an essay collection, kind of, which is like, they're trying to kind of articulate a field, which is often what these sort of edited volumes are attempting to do, kind of collecting essays on like parapolitics. And this is like, as we were just talking about, they're like kind of at the end of the Bush era, like in 2009, right? So it's sort of gone to the Obama era. And I think that with things like it is interesting to think about it in the historical context. I think that with things like the drone program and sort of the like Obama's sort of focus almost on like the intelligence agencies, even in like kind of his sort of imagery and branding, even though obviously like, Bush and like previous governments had like operationalized those things like extensively. There was this kind of like increased, like I do feel like there was a kind of cultural moment for the CIA. Like I remember that time when like it was Zero Dark 30. The Oscars were like dedicated to the glory of the CIA and like how amazing the CIA was.
That was a huge shift, and talk about that was also I think a turning point for me, because also I think, as I've discussed on the show before, I got very like fascinated and disturbed and interested in the drone program under Obama, like around kind of that time, like 2010, 2011. And it was a time that like all these movies, like first The Hurt Locker, even though it might have come out at the very tail end of Bush's presidency, was kind of the opening salvo of that, of making this Iraq war movie. But it's really kind of about like the trauma of like this guy, and like it sort of depoliticizes it in a weird way that like that was actually kind of a bridge to the sort of CIA girl boss Obama era of entertainment, where, it was like in between Jack Bauer and like the Alfreda Bukowski character in Zero Dark 30, or like Carrie on Homeland, was like the adrenaline junkie bomb diffuser guy, right? Who was just like, they kind of depoliticized it to like, he's just like addicted to the thrill of like the whatever. But it's kind of tragic, and like, look, he has PTSD and stuff. And then Zero Dark 30, which I remember when, I guess I'm assuming that like based cyber hacker unit of the DPRK like hacked Sony in 2014, because they released The Interview, which I think it subsequently came out. They practically bragged about it being like done in collaboration with the State Department and the CIA
Right.
to like
Yeah.
destabilize. Like they were gonna flood North Korea with USB drives and like smuggle them in. And they had this idea.
Right.
Like
I
Seth
remember
Rogen like
that.
joked
Yeah.
about this in interviews about like, yeah, we met some like sus CIA guy and he told us that like we should totally just like put this movie, like make the end of the movie where they murder Kim Jong Un in like a very comical, humiliating, ridiculous way, and then smuggle that movie into North Korea so that everybody like watches it, you know, privately on their little DVD players, and then like Kim Jong Un will lose face and he'll be humiliated, and like it'll sort of like destroy his cult personality and shit like that. That was really, man, that was really weird, a really weird era. But you know, we learned things out of that hack. That I think that was when some of the emails about Zero Dark 30 came out. And I remember this like because I was, you know, doing like the screenwriting thing, I think back at this time when it like came out. And I remember being like kind of fascinated to see Mark Bull, the screenwriter for Zero Dark 30, like his emails to like the heads of Sony, like right after Osama bin Laden died, about wanting to make this project, like were leaked. And he's basically like checking in with Sony like every day, like from like the minute it's announced that you know, bin Laden's dead, being like, oh my God, like I just like contacted the CIA and like I've begged them to like give me the access to like tell this story. And I forget if he was like quoting or just relaying what like the CIA Hollywood liaison guy was telling him, but I just remember reading it and it was just like so obvious that they were like fucking manipulating this like dumb ass like normie screenwriter, like who it's like he just like rushes in there and they're like, oh, perfect. Like we have this guy. We don't even need to like really psyop him. Like he's so eager. And he's really like, he's preemptively offering to like, I understand like it's so sensitive and it's national security. And if we have to change certain things or like, you know, shift it around the narrative around in a certain way, I totally get that. And I'm totally down to work with you. But please, like, I need to tell this story. Please, like, just let me tell it. And they're like, oh, I don't know, Mark. Like, it's just such a sensitive topic. I don't know if we'll ever be able to make a movie. And he's like, no, I can do it. I can do it in a way that makes the CIA look amazing. No, please, please, please. And then, of course, they let him do it. And that's exactly what the movie, you know, does. I just remember, like, I remember visiting my documentary professor from college, who's like, she's a real OG, like, documentary, you know, like, she's done a lot of whatever good work over the decades and stuff, but she was kind of like a grumpy like film head. And she was like in the academy the year that I like visited her, and she had all the screeners, and that year of course Zero Dark 30 was, you know, nominated and stuff. And like I saw it like in the box, I'm like, oh, like have you watched that yet? And she like looked at me with like disgust and was like, I don't watch propaganda. And I was like, oh damn, strong word. And that was like before, like when it came out, I wasn't as like noided about it as like even just a couple years later. But you know, it was kind of like, oh, okay, interesting. I didn't think it was that like exciting of a movie ultimately. Like it just, I kind of when I saw it, I sort of like judged it on like, okay, like how like intriguing or interesting and like into this world. And it's just there's something about, I don't know, yeah, like I didn't love it, but I was like surprised at the time that she called it like propaganda, like and was just like like this is like this goes too far, like this is a disgusting movie. And that, but I remember that being weird because she was like very liberal, and like all the kind of liberal, I feel like most of the liberal opinion around Zero Dark 30 was like that it's amazing, look at this girl boss who killed Osama bin Laden, like and then it took another few years to realize who that character was based on, who was, you know, Michael Schuyler's wife. I mean, later became Michael Schuyler's wife, Alfreda Bukowski, who I think got doxxed by some podcasters like years ago who were looking into 9/11 because she was in Alex Station. And in fact, like if you listen to their recounting of it and other people that worked with her, she actually like did a lot of the like either sus or incredibly incompetent shit that like prevented the CIA from sharing information with the FBI. So actually like far from, you know, being like the girl that saves the day, like she actually was like up to shit and like failed like miserably. But then I think it did come out around the early 2010s, because she stayed in the agency, that under Obama, right as the Syrian war and Libya were kicking off, she had become the head of something called like the global jihad unit at the CIA, which like I don't even it's like the counterterrorism center, which like I'd never heard of that like unit being referenced except like with her. I think that was in the Daily Beast or something. So I don't know if that's some goofy name they made it or a nickname. But then I think she did retire sometime in the mid 2010s. And then like I was so shocked when I found out that she had in fact like divorced her like think tank neocon husband and married her former boss, CIA officer Michael Scheuer, of course, known to listeners of this show as the one of the two mics on the like insane QAnon two mics podcast. Whereas like you can go listen to him for free anytime you want, you know, on any podcast platform. This is the guy that was like in charge of like hunting Osama bin Laden, and he's married to, you know, this woman who actually went like way further up than him, but like has a very like dark, and I believe she was also maybe one of the people that used to fly to black sites to like watch quote unquote terrorist suspects getting tortured. And like it even like creeped out other people in like the military and the CIA because like she didn't have to be there, but she just like wanted to like see it and watch. And like, so she's like a fucking sicko. I don't know. But then every liberal in America, see, this is how propaganda works, right? Like under Obama, like the CIA, you know, I remember you'd hear a lot back then. The CIA actually like told the Bush administration that it wasn't, you know, they didn't have WMDs, but then, you know, the politics got in the way, and these neocons who people perceived as like somehow totally different than the CIA, like they got involved and decided to like Dick Cheney all by himself and his Halliburton buddies like decided for the oil to go and do it. But the CIA, like, no, they didn't want to do it. I mean, I'm sure that's true because they didn't have WMDs, and there are probably some like mid-level analysts that were like, they like this guy, this Chalabi guy's lying to you. Like, they don't have them. And they're like, okay, shut the fuck up. Like, obviously there was like institutional, they were probably like pressured people to like, you know, spin reports certain ways, blah, blah, blah. But the kind of idea that like, oh, as an overall organization, you know, they just like, they're the ones we can trust. They're the responsible, sober. And then, you know, things like Zero Dark 30, things like Homeland kept reifying that kind of thing of like, they're scruffy, they're not perfect. Some of them have bipolar. You know, some of them are white guys who converted to Islam. Like, remember the guy, the what is it called? What do they call him? Like Mullah Mike or something like that? Like, Mike, I think it was like Mike D'Andreo or something like that. Who was the white convert, like CIA targeting officer guy. Yeah. And in the movie, they just show him like,
It's like, and it's so ridiculous too, because like, you know, not to impugn anyone's faith in Islam, however, there is like certainly like a phenomenon where maybe their heart opens to Islam later on, you know, but like a lot of like, what if you are marrying a Muslim woman, you know, it's very common for the man to convert to Islam in a way that might be described as like motivated by things other than like sincere religious feeling, but like, of course, in Zero Dark 30, he's like, you know, like praying 5 times a day in his office and everything, which like
in between drone strikes.
Like in terms of like, you know, obviously like everyone should pray 5 times a day, right? Like this is like a very important thing to do in Islam, but like globally speaking, I think that like you know, praying 5 times a day is very pious, you know, right. And obviously this is something that everybody should do. And it's really the bare minimum, like in terms of like, you know, the Muslim diaspora in the United States. But I just feel like, I don't know, whatever. It's like kind of a weird thing that like, it seems like when we read about that guy's biography, it seemed obvious that like his desire to convert to Islam was kind of
he married him. Okay. Like, yeah, I remember like, we did talk about him a while back.
Women can't marry non-Muslim men. So yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, but that was I forget how we started talking about this, but the PSYOP complex of like the late 2000s, early 2010s. So it wasn't, in a way, it wasn't like maybe the best, most anointed era, because there was a little like taking off of the pressure after Bush and his gang got out. There were people really gave, I think, you know, even if they're a little less you know, hyped about Obama, they're kind of like, oh, let's just give this new guy a chance, and like maybe that was an aberration, right? Like this
Yeah.
Bush thing, even though I think when you zoom out further between, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, like there's much more continuity than difference probably, but there definitely was a valorization, but I think it's also like a totally pragmatic and like practical one, not really morally based, of like getting overextended in Iraq was a strategic mistake, which is
Right.
always what, I guess we'll give points to Obama for being like consistent, though I'm sure he definitely, I mean, he would always say it's a dumb war. It's a dumb war. It was a dumb war. Like that was his line. It was a dumb war. And
Right.
I feel like Obama really, because he did have like people, that went on like what's his name? Brennan, and people like that advising him in 2008 that would go on to be like the CIA director. And I feel like he was speaking for like a faction of like the CIA that was, like the technocrats that, like that probably did think that these like kind of like Iran Contra neocon psychos were just like messing everything up. Like they were too sloppy and they were like, over ambitious. And, they rushed into things like invading Iraq that, sure, it had a lot of geopolitical advantages for us, but also like created a ton of problems. And, I think that there are probably other people within the national security apparatus who would have like preferred to sort of like, I don't know, prosecute these things like somewhat differently. And I think that when Obama got in, you got to see the other mode, which is like what Carl Oglesby kind of called like, the special war kind of philosophy that like JFK was very fond of when he was president, right? And actually strangely like Reagan too, even though Reagan talked a big game about military buildup and Star Wars and all that shit, like his real actions were more like sponsoring like a bazillion proxy wars with like death squads and like all these other irregular war things, right? Instead of, I mean, I guess he invaded Grenada briefly, but like not, there wasn't any like big land invasion thing. So with Obama, you started to see these like tactical little, interventions, which some of the essays in this book kind of do like call out as like, just as imperialist as, something like the Iraq War, but and actually has a lot of advantages that something like, invading Iraq doesn't have, which is the chief among which is like ambiguity and deniability. Like, it's one thing, like you can't avoid like 300,000 US troops going and occupying a country, that's you can't hide that. But, send in some Delta Force, some SEAL teams, some CIA assets, some mercenaries who of deniable connection, and things like that. Then and use proxies all the time, and then spin a media narrative. That's what another essay does point out, that like the cover is provided by the hegemonic, like basically, control or like massive influence of like Anglo-American media over the entire world. And so especially in more far-flung regions of the world that don't get regular coverage, if anything is even reported at all about something that happens in, the Congo or, some other kind of more obscure, far-flung, kind of place, that if it might not get reported on at all. But if it does, you can almost guarantee that it's going to be like heavily filtered through, the BBC or one of the American news networks. And, nobody's going to like, send a bunch of investigative reporters in and like get to the bot. Like, no, they're just going to, they're going to rely on one of these lazy crutches like, oh, that's just Africa, or like, oh, there's like ethnic conflict, or oh, like they're just poor because they're corrupt. Like, and, Americans generally won't think about it more than that. And so that's actually a very effective way to operate like as an empire, right? Especially when you are running around, especially when you're Obama running around the world apologizing to all the Muslim. Remember that? Like, there's still conservatives that are mad about his apology tour.
Right.
Which is like, dude, like, do you not realize that he's still doing imperial? Like, the apology tour is the cover so that we can keep doing imperialism. Like, that's what like really annoys me about like the right wingers sometimes. Is like you would love like are you mad that he's just not like obvious enough about it? Because like he's definitely doing it. Like, no, he's working for China, he's working for Iran. Like, just a kind of lazy brain kind of stuff. But we're gonna try to. The stuff we got today is more than lazy brain, I would say. However, I think something that came up at the end of the last part that we kind of want to, approach this book, that we want to have in mind as we approach this book is, I think already reading through like the first intro essay, there's like a couple things that would jump out to us, right? That we had already talked about, that are kind of, like a little bit of like, maybe not full red flags, but like yellow flags on the field in terms of like, I don't know about that characterization, right? Even though I do feel like I fuck with most of these essays, like in general, and I feel like they all that's the other thing I think we want to lay out very clearly about this book right out front. For anybody, I know there's really probably just one person out there, and for that person who likes to insist that parapolitics is like not serious and not academic and blah blah blah, as opposed to like deep politics or something else. Well, I mean, this is an academic collection of essays, like, right? Like, I think we can agree that these are credentialed, like, academics that are citing sources.
I mean,
and are we can disagree with them on other fronts, but I don't think we can say these guys aren't serious, right? Like,
I mean, as I was saying last time, I think like I have like issues with the idea of like parapolitics as like a discipline or like, something that is like kind of a discrete like field of knowledge, honestly. But I also feel like if you're gonna use the term, if what you mean is parapolitics, like I don't even know like what I think that he was maybe saying that Peter Dale Scott eventually like kind of reframed. Maybe if we read from Scott's essay in this volume today, we'll get like an indication of how he uses the term now, because I think that eventually he kind of moved towards using the term deep politics. And like in a way, I also prefer the term deep politics because it's less of like, it seems to have a more expansive connotation where it's like, okay, it's just like politics, like in a kind of like a deep systemic way, it doesn't necessarily connote, it doesn't have the same vibe of like being a polite term for a conspiracy theory that, is kind of gestured towards in the intro that, I want to briefly go back to before we get into the volume proper. And as I think people notice all the time, like there's something useful about the word parapolitics that makes people continue to return to it. I think it's like, I don't know what it is that like creates this appeal. I think it really is like the kind of social designation of certain ideas on like using this kind of like pejorative term like conspiracy theory, and then in order to like, but some of those things like have at least like not everything that's like discourse about those things like it like does have a basis in reality, obviously. However, like a lot of it is like, there is legitimacy to it, and it's kind of written off like, if you mention like, oh, I don't know what's like I guess the archetypal example is JFK, right? Like if you mention that at all, like there's obviously like crazy beliefs about like the JFK assassination, right? They were like a big feature of, I think like I'll just say that I find those beliefs to be a little bit insane, that like he faked his own death and he's like is somewhere and he's gonna come back, like that type of thing.
Like the QAnon stuff. Yeah.
However, like there's obviously some, like stuff that actually is like totally, legitimate and totally like by no means like crazy and very much grounded in reality that can be raised about that issue. But, like then it almost like concedes the frame in a way where you're like, oh, well, this thing that happened like is like we're gonna designate it as parapolitical, like because
instead of changing our definition of political, we sort of invent this term parapolitical.
I feel like by any definition that would be political, right?
The murder of a president is an inherently political act, no matter what way you slice it. And I mean, like the cover, the official story for it is almost I mean, I guess it's political in the sense, but like it's funny how depoliticized the official narrative of like Lee Harvey Oswald, even though he was a Marine Marxist Leninist who defected to the Soviet Union and then defected back and then hung out with a bunch of right-wing Cubans and Nazis and then like shot the president. And then like said he was a patsy and got murdered by a mobster. Like, it's like, but the way the official story of that is like, oh, he just like wanted to be, it's actually more like psychopolitical that like, oh, he wanted to be famous. Like, that's why he did it. Like he just wanted to be an important man of history, so that's why he did
Mhm.
it. And I mean, there's definitely assassins that have that like current going through them, but there's usually something else motivating them, like that's more specific and political about like why they hate the person they're, like John Wilkes Booth was part of a Confederate secret society and was
Mhm.
also like probably a narcissistic actor who, it's like kind of combined
Yeah.
perfectly. But like you need both those things kind of to like combine to generate the actions of John Wilkes Booth, sort of. And same with, a lot of other, like most other definitely successful political assassins. I mean, I guess John Hinckley is another one, but anyone after the 60s, you might have to put an MK asterisk on it. But I'm thinking of
Mhm.
older ones like, Anton Czolgosz, the Polish guy who shot McKinley. He was like probably kind of like definitely mentally unstable, but he was a hardcore anarchist who like hated all government and like
Yeah.
that was like really his vibe and like was like, yeah, fuck you, McKinley. But I think it's true that yeah, like inventing the thing, oh, it's parapolitics instead of insisting that it's politics, and this is just an extension of politics, but the reality of that is denied by like official history because there's
Mhm.
these walls set up, these conceptual barriers of like, nope, like that's outside politics. Like either it's baseless conspiracy theory and totally not serious at all. Or you could kind of call it parapolitics, but it's still kind of a nicer term for a thing that has been ghettoized, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Like a little bit, like even though it's softer, and unlike the term conspiracy theory, probably was not deliberately deployed by the CIA, like on purpose to, denigrate people who questioned the JFK assassination, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's that like the term conspiracy theory is so like poisoned
I
from
think that may
conception.
actually be like an urban myth. I know I feel like we said that before because I've
We
heard
have
it
to, I
like
mean,
and I thought
I've
it was
heard it
from
repeated
trustworthy
many, many
things.
times.
Yeah, but I think it's not actually true. Remember like looking into that one time and finding that like that wasn't the case that like this like or no, like there's no evidence of that. Um,
Well,
you
is there
know.
evidence of them like writing like I feel like I've seen like copies of like a memo that like say that, but maybe I mean it's one thing to
No,
say
no, no.
that they encouraged
I
them,
think that yeah, exactly. I think that you're right. Like I think that there was like a, encouragement to describe this as a conspiracy theory, right? I
but
think
that
that
they didn't
that
invent the
but they
term.
didn't invent the term
Fair
conspiracy
enough.
theory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's probably true. It's probably something that they saw, they observed, maybe some people having like a natural reaction to like that kind of thing. Or they must have been aware of it from, all those like UFO sightings and stuff from the 50s. Like that's a term that generally got like it probably did get bandied about, I bet, with like UFO people in the 50s, right? Like I'd be
Oh,
kind of
it got bandied
surprised.
about much earlier than that. Like
Right, right.
it's been a lot like
So
yeah.
so it really was kind of hijacked by the CIA, like, weaponized by the CIA to like, oh, associate people that believe the president was killed by like a conspiracy with like people that believe in aliens and people that believe in like lump them in with all these other things, right? And then it'll just have the ambient sense that like they're a little bit crazy, they're a little bit wacky, blah blah blah. And even though we do talk about like Bigfoot and UFOs on this podcast,
Yes. And like
I
it
think
also just was weaponized in general by like the entire like there was a lot of it wasn't just like the CIA, like I think that it was
oh, either the major
people who
media. I
yeah,
mean, like
well, yeah,
Henry, the
exactly.
Skull and
Like
Bones been running the media companies at the
yes.
time. Like these, like Henry Luce. Like I mean, all these
Yeah, which
people.
we
A lot of
still
these people were
see like so
friends.
yeah, I think that that's
Yeah,
another thing where people like use the CIA as like a proxy for, like vested interests in like the, media,
yeah,
government, military and like,
right.
intelligence like complex, that might
Which
not even be like, might actually
yeah.
just more often than not, I think like sincerely believe that at this point, like I think that's much more often than they know that like it's not like that this isn't just a conspiracy theory and they're saying this to or that this maybe this is a conspiracy but it's not completely baseless and they're
Mhm.
pretending that it's baseless in order to deflect suspicion. I think most people now who say that like are like they genuinely believe that like there's
I
no
think the media is so kind of
because
like
of this like sort of
room
culture
today.
of seriousness,
Right,
yeah,
right,
like that's like very strong, like it's a very powerful thing, like the sort
right.
of shame of being treated like unserious, it can really like
Yeah.
basically like totally foreclose like your thought. which is
I
what
think
I feel
that's
like
how it happens today with
Yeah.
with most of the like the say you're like NatSec reporters from the New York Times or Washington Post, when they call up their CIA source and the CIA source like just straight up tells them like the story, these people, I think first of all, it would be very unlikely in this day and age that they would get that job and be in that position if they were the type of person to not believe their CIA source. And then even if they are that type of person, to, push back on them or write something questioning it, in such a way. Like that has been so bred out of like official journalism that, you would be under threat of losing your access. And it's all about access, right? For some fucking reason. I don't know. I figure like if all the people are just gonna lie to you and like gaslight you and psyop you, like why don't you just like write things and like make educated guesses about what they're up to like we do? Like at that point, you know what I mean? Like, oh no, the access, like they're just spokesmen and spokespeople. Like, what the fuck access are you? It's so obvious that you can launder, anonymous sources from the national security community say, like, blah blah blah. Like it's so obvious you could launder bullshit through the media now, and they are not like gonna check up on it or whatever. So you could launder all kinds of crap, about all kinds of things. And I don't know. It's just like they're utterly domesticated, and it almost like defeats the purpose of. I just hate it when they talk about like my sources. Like I don't know. It's like we didn't go to J school, so I don't understand this religious like weird shit about like the source and like how I don't know. It's like how Seymour Hersh talks about his sources sometimes, who are obviously some of them must be like sus as fuck, and like I don't know what the hell they're telling him. But it's kind of like, oh, you can never like burn your, I don't know, source or like, I have to. I mean, I get in certain cases, like, yeah, when the government's like leaning on you, like to reveal whistleblowers, like, yeah, you want to protect people. But I don't know. It's like, yeah, all these things around access and like blah, blah, blah. It's it feels outdated and like by design has not been updated because it's so easy to game by like all the powerful institutions. So that it's like totally toothless and they hate not being seen as serious. That is like ego death to them.
And I think that like the embarrassment of like, for instance, like to me, it's like, okay, like I said that the conspiracy, like the CIA, like, I don't know if we even said they invented it or if we said they popularized it or whatever, like, but the embarrassment of like saying that, like, yeah, it's like embarrassing to get something wrong. But for some people, it's like just terrifying to even like be associated with like someone who might like say something that's wrong in that direction. And it's like much like more comfortable to be wrong in the direction of like, oh, let's give all these like evil people the benefit of the doubt. Like let's give like Mad Dog Mattis the benefit of the doubt. Let's give like McMaster the benefit of the doubt. Like
Bill
shit
Maher is a
like,
patriot because he said Trump was a wackadoodle once. Like, it's like, okay, he also like trafficked tons of cocaine into Mina and like, was like involved with CIA officer Robert Johnson was, and blah, blah, blah.
Like accidentally saying something bad about, or, like saying something about like Frank Zappa or like some like, accidentally saying something bad about these people. Like it's like if you're gonna actually like come forward and like criticize these like heroes, then you better like really I think that's like a component of it as well, like that
nobody gets dinged points for just believing
the risk of like taking one step towards like a little bit of criticism of like some of these like bloodthirsty people like is like so much greater than the risk of just staying quiet and like and talking about like systems and things like that,
right. So I think to your original point that I think it is automatic, especially today with people in the like journalists and kind of like especially journalists. I think these days it's like they don't even need to be kind of a coerced or like, I think when we read about older things like Operation Mockingbird, I think there was more of that back in when all this was getting going in the 50s and 60s of, they really did have journalists like on the payroll and would like give them envelopes of cash and like tell them to like plant certain stories. Nowadays, I feel like the professional class that rises to the level of being hired at the New York Times is already like programmed to do that without even needing to be like bribed.
Exactly.
Like basically, like they're the type of people that will do that, and that's why
the
they
idea
have
that they would need to be bribed is so funny because like that, yeah, not even remotely. Like
you
I
know
feel
what the
like
bribe
anyone,
is? You know what the bribe is? Having a job at the New York
yeah,
Times. That's
I
the
feel
bribe because that's their identity.
true.
That's their
I feel
ego.
like any
That's
any
all you
like
need.
CIA or like intelligence agency person who would be bribing someone like the New York Times like should be fired because like they're doing something totally
They're
unnecessary.
wasting taxpayer money.
I feel like if you offer them a bribe, then they would say like, oh no, like no thank you, and then they would like not even report it.
Right, exactly. They would,
like
they have their like
yeah, so
their little
yeah.
ethics that cover the greater ethical gaps in like how they do their jobs, right? They have their little rules that they can like their little hall monitor rules they could stick to of like, I don't know,
and what is like what's reasonable. I mean, we saw like that's the thing, like I think that also like another reason why like Operation Mockingbird was something that was necessary then, or was felt to be necessary at least, is because like there was at least a perception, and like to an extent like it was an accurate perception, that there was like a real like ideological enemy that could like an ideological alternative that people like in the United States were like drawn to. Whereas now I feel like there's just so much like ideological capture that's not even like something. I mean, you did see like the New York Times newsroom basically being like torn apart. Well, not even really torn apart, but like there definitely was dissent in like the New York Times newsroom over Gaza, right? Like there were people who were like, and there were leaks. And what they do, they like basically did like a whole like trial. They did like, they like hunted people down. They did like a mini like McCarthy situation where they like went and like interview, like, they targeted like every like Arab American they had working for them, or like anyone who like, interrogated them to try to figure out like who the leak was and who had these sympathies, and like, the little workplace slacks being like torn apart over like the phrasing that he used. But like, there's still like this like, oh, well, it's entirely appropriate to describe like them as terrorists and not as like fighters or anything like that, and yeah, or like things, and like the sort of the language, like not like these sort of the serious like little rules about how they talk, and like their little
passive voice of
they
like
have like hanging on the wall,
like killed in like
yeah, exactly, they like and
airstrike results
that's completely
in
not an accident. Yeah, exactly. Like Palestinians mourn like death of the exactly, or something like that. Yeah, like okay, well that's
all kinds of ways to soften up that copy.
yeah. Like okay, well who caused the death? Like why are they? Yeah, like they were killed. Also a bunch of Palestinians were killed, not just like the ones that are alive or mourning, but also like they're mourning because like 1,000 people were murdered.
Bury the lead, as they say. Yeah. Do they still have that Herzl photograph in the editor's room?
I don't know. Yeah, like as far as I know,
I assume that picture was real. I remember it making the rounds months ago, but I haven't seen it in a while. But that it did appear to be, like the famous portrait of Herzl was like on the wall in the editor's room in the New York Times. And I don't know if it was a picture from like a few years ago. It would be pretty wild to have it up there after October 7th. But
they did have him on the wall. They had a bunch of notable people like Thomas Edison and stuff like that. Andrew Carnegie, Bill Gates, Woodrow Wilson, Bill Clinton, Anwar Sadat, Jimmy Carter, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Mikhail Gorbachev, Chiang Kai-shek, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Howard Hughes, Hubert Humphrey, J.P. Morgan, Warren G. Harding.
That's a very on-brand New York Times list for them.
Yeah,
like it's a mix of like Chiang Kai-shek, but also like Gorbachev, like like they're liberal. Like, oh my God, fucking New York Times. Okay, I think today in this final part, we're gonna go through this book and kind of use it like to do a little praxis of our method, which we are resisting labeling. It's just the SJ method. It's just the SJ approach. That's all it is.
It is the SJ.
It's actually doing the subliminal jihad. But we're gonna go through this because I think this is a overall pretty good collection of essays. Now the first part is more theoretical, the first half. The second half are like case study essays, including one which I think we're gonna do a close reading of to kind of cap this whole thing, of a Peter Dale Scott essay about drugs and intelligence agencies in Mexico. And I think we can sort of glean from that how, because I think he does invoke the word parapolitics multiple times in it, how he uses the term. And also, I think respectfully, if there are any slight interventions we would make as part of our SJ method, we can sort of do them. And I guess, show rather than tell our method, because at the end of the day, that's the best way to do it. It's just by doing it, right?
Yes.
Though it has been
Mhm.
interesting to reflect upon, like, what exactly it is we
Yeah.
are doing and not doing. But
Mhm.
I think this will be
Or
this
what we
will
like
this will
want to
clarify it in a
do.
more grounded sense.
Yeah, I think that it's worthwhile. People do. I mean, people often talk about like methodology, and obviously we don't. We haven't had like the systematic discussion of it that like others do when they talk about having a methodology. But yeah, I don't really like to. Again, I don't like to set anything in stone because I feel like you know, uh, it's vibes based, as a great parapolitical scholar would say.
Right. It
And
is.
yeah, so.
Yeah,
But I did
yeah.
want to read. We didn't read this part from the introduction, or we read parts of it, but we didn't really like read them in context. And I did
Mhm.
want to we left off with the introduction. I did want to read like this part on states and parastates, which I
Yeah.
think is interesting because it sort of just it offers like an etiology of like the field of study of parapolitics and things like that. So let's like just read this.
Okay.
It's called State and Parastates, the subsection here. Parapolitics as a field of study arises from shortcomings in the dominant approach to politics and international relations, which treats the state as a special institution in human affairs, having structure, intention, agency, and even personality, as well as attributes such as sovereignty, in a way that other human institutions do not. Well, I mean, there's certainly truth to that when you hear things about states having rights to exist and things like that. But yeah,
Yeah.
so that seems like a
Hmm.
legitimate criticism. The special reification of the state has tended to create an almost unbridgeable systemic and intellectual distinction between domestic politics and international relations. It also obscures the connections between them and focuses attention away from institutions which, in some respects, resemble states, but which are not part of the international club of fully recognized, functioning sovereign states. The pernicious effects of this distinction can be seen in the contradiction between the attempts of the US, along with Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, to use drug networks as assets or proxies in the Cold War, while simultaneously attempting to suppress the drug trades within their own borders. At the same time, international relations struggles to cope with states which do not quite match up to the expectations of membership in the international community. U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright identified as failed states those countries with a weak or non existent central authority. Others have talked of weak or weakened states, which fail to exercise the authority expected of them, of complex states, defined as countries with two or more linked wars or crises, and even of collapsed states, a mere geographical expression, a black hole into which a failed polity has landed. Others have written of rogue states, defying international order, and of microstates, some of which are called states of convenience, like Vanuatu and the Cayman Islands, whose prime purpose is to provide territoriality for relief from the legal obligations required by public states. There are also important state like entities that control territory and exercise many or most of the functions of a state without being recognized as a state for international relations purposes. These unrecognized states include Abkhazia, Anjouan, Puntland, the Shan states, Somaliland, South Ossetia, and Waziristan, as well as the semi internationalized territories of Kurdistan and Kosovo. There are also countries such as Lebanon, Colombia, Afghanistan, Burma slash Myanmar, and the Philippines, where significant regions are completely beyond the control of the central government, even if they are not generally recognized to be separate. For a long time, it has been recognized that mafias provide rudimentary services in urban ghettos or inaccessible rural areas, but the recent rise in the number of failing states has been accompanied by the rise of a number of alternative groups, or quasi states, often revolutionary in character. To maintain their popularity, these quasi states try, like the state, to satisfy the citizens whom they tax. For example, the Christian Phalange, this is the part that we kind of read earlier, a pro government militia in Lebanon, provided all public services, including street cleaning, transportation, planting of trees, retail price control, street patrols, etc. The anti government Muslim Hezbollah in South Lebanon, like Hamas in Palestine, has provided similar services. The most important innovation of parapolitics, however, is to treat as state like entities a range of institutions which do not, at first glance, resemble states but which nonetheless possess some of the important characteristics of states. These entities include covert entities, semi autonomous intelligence agencies, cabals, secret societies, and elite power groups, such as the Greek KYP, Pakistan's ISI, P2, Opus Dei, or the Safari Club, which seek to control or manipulate state violence independently from within. Okay, that's interesting. I think we can kind of unpack what they mean by independently from within later, but
but
in this
definitely
section,
from within. But
but it is interesting that like they're considered to be independent.
Independent from whom, I guess, is maybe independent of
I
like
guess maybe this like
the
harkens
normative
back
legal
to,
process, like political system of like voting and representatives, I guess.
I guess this kind of harkens back to Easton's idea, but I almost feel like this is reliant upon kind of a almost false distinction between, and maybe this actually is what they're criticizing. So maybe but I almost feel like, anyway. So criminal structures, also mafias, drug networks, militant organized religious networks, Russian criminal entrepreneurs, which exist in parallel symbiosis with the state. And so, you could definitely see like the kind of war on terror, as you were mentioning, like this has a very strong like war on terror kind of patina to it, and then he writes revolutionary and terrorist movements which seek to overthrow one or more existing states, but whose territorial control is limited to sanctuaries, often the territory of others, and to the equivalent of safe houses. Recognizing the growing power in the world of these entities, and above all of drug networks and of terrorist groups, conventional political science has come to speak of non-state actors. But Loretta Napoleoni has shown that the distinction between states and non-state actors is artificial and misleading. In today's world, some terrorist organizations, notably the PLO and Hamas, have had larger budgets, bureaucracies, and armies than some of the states among which they live. What then to call them? Napoleoni coins the term state shell, but this term might be taken to imply external form without internal content, the reverse of what is meant. Other possibilities include incipient state or partial state, but both terms imply a tendency to end up as full states, which is not necessarily the case. In this introduction, we use the term parastates, partly because it creates a link with parapolitics, partly because it avoids teleology. As Napoleoni's analysis makes clear, economics is crucial in sustaining parastates. In 1998, the International Monetary Fund estimated that illicit funds worldwide amounted to between 800 billion and 2 trillion, 2 to 5% of the world's GDP. In some states, the black economy, or gross criminal product, exceeds the formal economy. In Pakistan, for example, the black economy was, by the late 1990s, 3 times the size of the formal economy, and twice as much money from foreign remittances passed through the informal hawala system as through the formal banking system. In developed states, the black economy can be partially integrated through money laundering into the formal economy. For half a century, laundered profits from drug trafficking have been recycled into American and Canadian real estate, notably in Florida and Nevada. It is significant that before the U.S. offered an emergency bailout to Mexico in 1982, thus preventing a default on payments to overextended U.S. banks, the CIA first verified that drug trafficking represented a significant source of the Mexican foreign exchange earnings needed for repayment. Conventional political theory, with its focus on the state as an arena and on its institutions as agents in domestic politics, fails to direct our attention towards parapolitics. So does conventional international relations theory, with its emphasis on sovereign states as coherent agents in international affairs. As Clifford Geertz, again, who we sort of mentioned, right? So I think it's interesting that he comes up here. As Clifford Geertz comments on the state suggest, there may be a growing willingness to accept that there are limits to the usefulness of, quote, state as an analytical concept. The enormous variety of the state's forms and expressions and the multiplicity of the regimes it houses and of the politics it supports render the very idea elusive, awkward, protean, and problematical. Parapolitics, with its attention to divided sovereignty, to illegal trade as a substitute for taxation, and to a world of safe zones analogous to the safe houses of domestic organized crime, is well placed to develop a new agenda. What will distinguish between the parapolitical approach is a perspective which does not take the point of view of the state itself. Instead, it sees the state as competing for power and legitimacy with alternative power groupings, especially parastates, which themselves exhibit some of the same power features as the state. There is room in this neutral approach for both criticism and defense of traditional notions of state power and legal sovereignty. So I like they talked about like criticism and defense of traditional notions of state power. I guess I don't know what they mean by traditional, but I also I don't know. What do you think about this? Because
well, I don't quite agree with. I mean, I do agree that conventional political theory, with its focus on the state as an arena and on its institutions as agents in domestic politics, fails to direct our attention towards parapolitics, and so does international relations theory, etc. But I don't know if I agree with like that. Basically, that what will distinguish the parapolitical approach is a perspective that doesn't take the view of the state, the point of view of the state itself. Instead, it sees the state as competing for power and legitimacy with alternative power groupings, especially parastates. I don't know. Like, yeah, I'm not exactly like, I don't know about this state v parastate like dichotomy. Like, I don't think that's actually relevant to like what most people are getting at with like parapolitics. Like, I think even like Peter Dale Scott's kind of framework, I don't think like that just seems like an unnecessary restricting framework to put on. And it's like, oh, this is about, you know, how states compete with legitimacy, as if the states, but then like,
as
just
if
that makes it sound like the states
like,
aren't complicit ever with the parastate, and they're
or
like
that they
antagonistic.
have some kind of like fixed identity and aren't like made up of. Again, I feel like the state, like I definitely agree with the critique that I honestly agree with what they quoted from Geertz, that like a state is a like kind of like a legal fiction. It's a fiction in many ways, right? There's many ways that like we, you know, reify the idea of the state, right? And it's also like a historically contingent concept, like the modern notion of a state, like a Westphalian state, as they kind of mention later, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of their argument for why like parapolitics is like a new thing because of historical trends, right? They say one of the historical trends that is the reason why parapolitics is a recent historical phenomenon that is primarily of the period after World War I, is that like the so-called Westphalian system of sovereign states spanning every square centimeter of land and an increasing proportion of the sea do not cope easily with the aspirations for national self-determination that do not coincide with existing state boundaries or with the reality that significant regions may be beyond the power of state authorities. The Convention of Territorial Integrity, intended to outlaw conquest as a tool of national aggrandizement, makes secession difficult unless it can be grounded in historical borders, right? So it says there's tension between international law and practice. But I don't think that is, I mean, the domain of international law obviously is a new thing, but I don't think that contradiction between legal theory and practice, like in a way that, you know, affects the states and their interaction, or like, you know, governments and their interaction, and like groups that exercise power or institutions that exercise power within, you know, like that see themselves as part of like a larger enterprise or whatever, or even independent of it. I don't think that that's new. Like, I don't think that that is like, and I don't really see how like a definition of parapolitics that is confined to the conflict between international law in the very narrow sense, like, because obviously there is like law of the sea, like even in the early modern period, you know, there are like kind of the rudiments of international law, right? That's kind of what these sovereign citizens, you know, we're always talking about when they're like admiralty law,
like that. You have no jurisdiction over here. Am I free to go? Am I
right.
under
Like there's, you know, so like
no, for real.
I think that is like kind of a very like a very narrow framework, and I think that rather than like talking about like recognizing that the state, not necessarily believing what like discourses produced by the institutions that like comprise the state or identify with the state say about like you know, their own self-image, like not necessarily, you know, accepting that at face value is important, but I almost feel like it does that in a way to say that like these, you know, to put these things in a like a parastate role, and not understand like them as, or I don't know, to even like to kind of create this dichotomy between like a state proper and parastates, right? I guess like there is a sort of a formal official discourse, right? So I guess it's talking about non-official aspects of the state in a way, right? But I also don't think that necessitates a concept of parapolitics.
No, it's almost like a different conversation. Like, I agree that like parastate seems like, I'll accept that as a term for kind of vague, you know, groups that have a kind of like mostly a monopoly on violence and like territory, and sort of like perform the function somewhat of a state, but aren't quite, you know, like, okay, fine, parastate. Yeah, that's great. Or, you know, some kind of like mafia, like cartel network that kind of like governs a region, like, sure. But to tie that so in like closely to like the field of parapolitics,
well,
like, I mean,
like,
they also say that it's
like,
not just a new,
like,
they say it's a new term and a recent historical phenomenon. And I feel like that is not the frame I would like. If we're going to use a big sweeping term like that, I don't think it should be that historically specific to like the 20th century after World War One, because you're right, there are like long running trends that have kind of like even just the modern world. If you talk about the rise of like corporations, like
especially
you
if
said,
this has to
maritime
do,
law.
yeah, exactly, especially if this has to do with like, yeah, the interaction between like official like discourses or like official like legal definitions of the state versus like how the state actually operates. Like
Mhm.
that's basically been going on forever. um
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, or like semi-officialized, like, things are like black economies that's like existed forever.
Well, I
Like,
think it might be clarifying to I'm just gonna read this next paragraph because after that, they say that, oh, this started around World War One, because I think it sheds light. It's something we can kind of like poke at, because I think it does point to maybe what they're trying to get at. But anyway, so they go on to say parapolitics appears to have emerged from a confluence of three historical trends. The first of these trends is the spread of democracy during the 20th century, including the enfranchisement of women, the poor, and through decolonization, former colonial subjects. At one level, this enfranchisement has increased the likelihood of at least occasional democratic outcomes, which threaten important entrenched political, social, and economic interests. At another level, it has focused attention on the potential effectiveness of manipulating public opinion so as to achieve desired outcomes from the democratic system. Awareness of the power of propaganda in the broadest sense to manage, that is to say, manipulate, public opinion has been deeply subversive of confidence in democracy and has given rise to a sustained effort by states to counter what they term subversion by means of the clandestine management of public opinion. In particular, state security intelligence organizations have been recruited on numerous occasions to stage phony events designed to create public alarm for political purposes. Okay, so we could evaluate that one right there, because I mean, obviously, I think we agree that is a valid subject. Like that's a dimension of, I think, what we talk about, right? Is the important the efforts to manipulate public opinion in a variety of ways,
mhm.
both by governments and private individuals and institutions and corporations, right? I think that that gets to the heart of, I think, what it's like, what people find valuable in parapolitics, or like the politics of that which is hidden or spun or manipulated in our kind of official history, and even sometimes ontologies of like the world that you kind of get in trouble for like violating, and so parapolitics is kind of but also, the study of this manipulation itself, and like, factoring it in. Now, as for, this is all very focused
And
on
I also feel like,
democracies, though,
yeah, that like
and
this
that
whole
part I'm not so
idea,
sure about.
yeah, like this is like the sort of a Santa sentence to me, the one that says like, the spread of democracy, brought the enfranchisement of women, the poor, and through decolonization, former colonial subjects. Well,
Eh,
yeah, like,
yeah,
like, well, this is
like,
really, I think, they get like this enfranchisement has increased the likelihood of at least occasional democratic outcomes. I don't think that like
Kwame Nkrumah's
like
like theme song is about to start playing,
democracy
and he's
is
going to
like the
storm out
biggest,
here.
like, yeah, democracy is like the biggest farce like concept. Like the idea that like the U.S. is a democracy is just like so, like, like what choice do the American people actually have?
I wish, like, if this writer had attached like ostensible or apparent democracy, like I feel like the paragraph would be, I could agree with it a lot more. But they're just saying, yeah, the spread of democracy, and then like the enfranchisement of women, and it's like, like you could say like the nominal enfranchisement of women, and the poor to like technically vote in a very like indirect way that is like ultimately does not really like exercise much control over the actual political system. Like that control, those inputs are, and those things are decided elsewhere, higher up the food chain, right? And
Yeah.
decolonization is like, more of a, segue into neo-colonialism. So
Yes.
to give, they're giving way too much credit to, the very structures that parapolitics is supposed to like investigate and be skeptical of, in kind of accepting their own language, their own PR about what this
Mhm.
thing. And I think it is valuable. I get that the overall vibe from this is they want to wake people up that maybe are normies who just believe that we really have a pretty good democracy, that functions the way we're told it does, and wake them up to the fact that this thing actually, does get influenced by, sinister kind of invisible forces that are kind of outside of the democratic food chain, and they have a lot of influence as well. And also, like, there's been active manipulation of public opinion by powerful forces. Now, that I'm all for that, right? Like, I really want people to have that sink in, right? And be part of the way they look at the world, right? Like, I find it almost certainly kind of like politically perilous, and I think like personally like perilous to believe in America, like the way, we were taught in school at this point, right?
I almost feel like this essay seems like kind of pitched at like, I don't know,
Those
like
types of
government
people.
functionaries or something. Like, like people who really like believe in America, because like all the examples, like the primary examples are like Pakistan or like places where like, I don't know, like the homeland audience is like worried about, like something
Even
like
though,
that.
like they have had
There
periodically
are.
elections in Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of other countries that, we might not consider really so democratic, but I would challenge, any of those people to like look at our system similarly as like, a quote unquote banana republic where it's like,
I was we were talking a little bit about like ISIS last time and like the kind of like false, well, not like completely false, however, like the exaggerated difference between like, the like foreign fighters who like went to go join up with ISIS and the foreign fighters who went to go join other groups in the Syrian civil war. Like a lot of them were operating on like incomplete information or, just like bloodthirsty maniacs. And like the groups that they joined, like were both complicit in atrocities, right? And like it reminds me of like some of these like dumbass like foreign fighters who spoke English, at the time, like kind of like you had these like ISIS supporters on social media, right? Like
oh, I
very
remember that era.
early on, right? And I remember like one person like something, like some like
something. Yeah, I remember
like one
Abu
of the
something and something.
there are a lot of ums and a lot because like there's so these are like
Hashtag
women,
witness, one finger emoji.
these are like a lot of women, and like and like that's the thing, like obviously like ISIS was like a terrible group. However, like maybe people now in the current like sort of climate can understand that like for a lot of Muslims, when they first started hearing like whisperings about some of the things or like sort of like murmurings from, and it took a while for that stuff to like kind of hit the mainstream media, and like so when it first started to kind of percolate, like especially like people like in the diaspora, people who didn't really know too much or people who were just like kind of like for whatever reason, like they didn't necessarily believe that because and they kind of like stuck to this sort of rosy image, or they were being told bullshit things by people who were in like Syria, who were saying like, yeah, come down, so like these people were like obviously fools in the same way that people who are like, yeah, I'm a heckin' Marxist, I'm gonna go fight for the CIA, were fools,
right. You're seeing
like,
the propaganda, the very flashy ISIS propaganda like worked in like manipulating certain people, right? Like,
yes, and they also like the sort of the general lack of trust that particularly Muslims have of like the sort of mass media coverage of Muslims contributed to that.
It's like the boy who cried wolf, like, oh look, the Muslims are doing it again, it's like,
right.
Okay,
well, we saw that in Palestine, right, where it's like all these like they're decapitating babies, like there's like just a bunch of like lies and things like that. So
Gaddafi
like,
gave out 30,000 Viagra tablets. So soldiers going on a mass raping spree right now. We have to stop. It's
in
like
the early days, like people didn't necessarily like I was not among them. Like in any
Oh,
way.
I know you
However,
weren't.
like there were people who, yes, right. I was always like just completely appalled and like truly like devastated. Like to see people like using Islam to justify the things that ISIS did. But anyway, my point was that I remember one of these accounts posted something like because at the time like there was a lot of it was like a huge media blitz over ISIS. It was just like everywhere. And there was like kind of a graphic that someone had made that was like territories held by the Islamic State group, and they had these kind of like a heat map of like where
Black
ISIS controlled
ink
the
blot,
most.
like
Yeah, right. And like where like its kind of control was weaker, and things like that. And like one of these accounts, posted like control, like, the United States group, and it was like a map of the United States with like the same kind of thing where like, certain areas were like under control and certain areas like weren't, so like it was like obviously like, it's not, there's not actually an equivalent. Well, we could draw many equivalencies, including like a practical one, but the like in terms of the relationship between the United States and ISIS.
Right.
However, like there is something in a way to that account's critique, because what they're saying is that like for them, like they consider this to be like a state, and they consider them to have like these laws. And the United States, obviously they have like many more like much more power in order to enforce this, right? Like, and they have like, I guess maybe a longer existence or something or whatever, but it's kind of the same basic concept, right? That it's like a state that survives because people opt into it. People like believe in it or beholden to like these structures, even like in both cases, like by coercion. So
that's true. Also, I mean, yeah, that
yeah,
usually
so
is an element of anything you would call a state is like
yeah, and like like in the sort of like wilderness like of the United States, like in the Rocky Mountains, like can the United States like apply its laws? It can't apply its laws like in a lot of cases, right? Like oftentimes like the laws of the United States like are not applied effectively outside of the cases where like they're they don't even attempt to apply them, or where there's sacrificial ways to like sort of ignore them.
Right.
So I think that in a way, like saying that, making this kind of binary between like parastates and states per se is like not necessarily like helpful, rather than looking at like the mechanisms of power that like create like or that make up the actual operation of power in the world, rather than like including like discourses of statehood, like imagined communities or whatever, or imagine like imagined entities and things like that, right? And like how those discourses function. But I feel like saying like, oh, this is more of a state than that, I don't know, like are there things that are like more a state than others?
I
like,
could say it up to an extent
that,
like I could say it up to an extent of it being almost like a spectrum or a sliding scale of like stateness, where some of these more informal groups or like a militia or rural insurgency that has a kind of like nominal influence or control over territory would be on the very like light, like loose end of the spectrum. And then you scale up from there, but it's kind of like the same thing. It's just a matter of like how much power you have and your effectiveness and like exercising it like is what increases. But maybe these aren't separate categories entirely of like, oh, these are the states and then these are the parastates and
right.
kind of
Well,
thing.
I feel like this kind of gets into the like, and these kind of things are like confused in a way often, where like I on one hand, like I see the idea that like, okay, some are recognized by international law, right? Like these are recognized by these countries, really, like
right.
The United States like recognizes them in a lot of ways, like really it's up to the United States to recognize like which, the United States determines what states are going to be recognized and which ones aren't, in a big way, right? That's, I think, is something that should be acknowledged.
I mean, they have critical veto power over it, and they can also like insist someone's a state when nobody else agrees with it. As is
right, exactly. This is kind of the thing of like, there's never been a state of power, or like something like that, right? Like it's like there's never been a state like this, but like to their point, like there are like there's obviously like an institutional base. There's obviously a people there. There's obviously an idea of a state, but the thing is like that it's not like recognized, right? And then there's like, so I think that, I mean, in a way, like maybe that goes to their point of like these are kind of competing groupings, right? Like exhibit some of the same power and features as the state, right? But
I just don't see them competing in the sense of like, I know they said that they want to avoid teleology, but it still feels like setting them up in opposition to each other like presages like at one point like one might like triumph over or absorb the other. And I don't know if that I don't know. I just don't know how much that framework like does it for me, or how useful it is. Especially,
exactly. I agree with the idea that they're competing is not necessarily like.
And I don't think it's the most
like,
interesting aspect of like the whole parapolitical thing is like I think the way they're approaching, and this is kind of a this was much more of an emerging field, I think, in the 2000s in the post-Cold War era, because there were these new polities or sort of like regions, that nebulously governed regions, right? I mean, everywhere from like certain regions in Yugoslavia to Chechnya to West Africa, all kinds of places. And so I think there was a lot more scholarly attention paid to like how do we label and like define these things now, especially now that the like binary dialectical struggle between, you know, the Soviet bloc and America and like the American West is like, you know, sort of been resolved. And I don't know, like, yeah, I think it'll be easier to talk about this if we get into maybe some of the subsequent essays, because I think we can still point out like a couple things. And I mean, the other thing, maybe we'll just read the three historical trends, because we only just talked about the first one, and then we can kind of like move on. Yeah, because I'm not quite sure about the second one. They say the second historical trend, I guess, influencing the rise of parapolitics, has been the massive growth of government regulation of society and the economy, especially of morality and the environment. This regulation has created niches for organized criminality where few or none existed in earlier times. That is to say, the law, by creating a barrier which excludes many or most people from participating in a certain activity, effectively reserves that activity for those who are strong enough, clever enough, or daring enough to cross that barrier. Environmental protection measures and moral protection measures represent especially fertile areas for organized crime because they restrict profitable or enjoyable human activity for highly generalized social benefits. The classic example is prohibition in the US, during which laws banning the sale and consumption of alcohol created a barrier which organized crime was best equipped to surmount. The consequences of prohibition in creating a base for organized crime in the US have lasted well beyond the end of the ban on alcohol. We can now point to a large number of comparable cases falling into four major categories: drugs, sex, technology, including software and arms, and environmental contrabands, illegal logging, trade in endangered species, relabeling and disposal of toxic waste, and the illegal trade in chlorofluorocarbons. In short, greater regulation in recent historical times has created more niches for criminality. I don't know about this whole one. Like, I don't know about like the vector of this one, that like government. I understand the prohibition argument, right? Like, I'm very familiar with that, and I think there's a lot to that. In that, right? You know, pretty much like, yeah, all these criminal forces were able to like build empires after alcohol was prohibited. At the same time, I don't know if I take it as like the immortal axiom that like any government kind of regulation of like environmental stuff or the economy or like anything at all, like just necessarily creates massive illegal markets for it. Like I'm a little bit less, I don't know, because like
I
don't
agree.
know, like take like weed for example. Like they've like legalized weed basically now. It's everywhere. I don't know. It's like so I don't know if you could say that. And the real question, I guess, is how criminal is like the weed industry now that it's like been legalized? It just sounds a little libertarian to me that like, oh, also, I don't know, the massive growth of government regulation of society and the economy. I mean, I guess you could say that the governments around the world have become much more effective at exercising their regulatory powers because of like technology and other things like that. But we're also we were more regulated 40 years ago than we are today in like a whole variety of ways. So in that sense, like, and I think criminality also like rose massively along with like the financial deregulation and, you know, stuff like that from like the 70s, 80s onwards. Like the whole neoliberal thing, even like, you know, like NAFTA conveniently passed right when I think another essay like points out, I think Peter Del Scott does, that you know, like NAFTA was signed, you know, developed by Bush and President Salinas, and that was around the time that the Mexican quote unquote cartels took over, I think, about half of the Colombian cocaine trade to the US, you know, just in time for that border to open, right? And you know, then there's been like a massive increase in drugs coming from Mexico ever since. And so that was deregulatory, and it led to a massive rise in criminality. So I don't think I don't see this as like the main driver of like the criminality that is talked about in like the parapolitical field is like, oh, somebody tried to regulate something. Unless you want to say, I don't know, the like communists coming in. See, I don't know, like, you know, the communist countries that really did go after drug trafficking, I feel like they saw a severe reduction for a long time in like drug use, right? Like think about China and
Yeah.
the Soviet Union. Like I know there are always drugs there, of course, but was China really like slinging out that opium after Mao took over? No, that was like Chiang Kai-shek, right? That was,
Mm-hmm.
you know, all the people in the Golden Triangle, and like actually like the Mao's whole thing was like, you know, being very harsh about like opium production, you know, opium dealers and things like that for, you know, a lot of historical reasons, right? So, you know, sometimes I feel like if a government is like sincerely committed to like the social project of like tamping down like severe drug addiction or something like that, and enough people support it, then that's like a different question than just like, oh, the government's regulating again. Time to go out
Yeah. And
and start an illegal drug enterprise. Like,
yes, I think that like it's interesting because basically they're saying that like it certainly isn't true that like there hasn't been a concept of like, you know, these things being immoral or illegal in the past. What's changed is like
yeah.
the apparatus, like you were saying, the apparatus of policing like has become like incredibly more like invasive and incredibly more like developed and powerful. But does that mean that like criminality is more again, like it kind of depends on like what how are you defining like a crime? You know, like how like just because yeah, I like I don't get it. Like, you know, was like the Medici family, like were they not involved in like, you know, organized crime? Um like
Yeah, a lot of these terms get fuzzy when you're saying like, okay, like, because I don't know, evading environmental protection measures, it sounds like something a corporation would do, and it would probably do it in a way that's like a sus loophole that, you know what I mean? Like they're the ones that are probably like evading the sort of the white collar side of
and
business
separately
is
from the
also
question of whether there even is greater regulation now, which I think is totally a legitimate question. However, like
right.
it really depends like how you define like certainly on the moral front. But like I don't think that there's more crime now than there's ever been or something. You know, like or more like sort of organized or like sort of I don't know, like parastate crime or anything like that, you know, to use their term. I don't think that's true either. Like I think
I
there's
don't
been
think it's
like
true,
cults,
but
like organized criminal groups, like for a really long time.
I think
Um,
what has happened, I think another one of these essays kind of advances this theory that maybe the reason we don't see, you know, like the Italian mafiosos anymore, like running around, like, you know, doing their old rackets in the same way as they used to, is because there's been this kind of like real melding of that like organized underworld and like the business, the international like finance and business worlds, and like also the government world. And they all kind of like basically that the sort of the straight world adopted many of the techniques that were kind of like pioneered in organized crime, and organized crime has also adopted many of the techniques that were, you know, made up by like Bert Cantor and Paul Hellawell and like Castle Bank, you know, like the original offshore tax shelters for the wealthy are also perfect vehicles for laundering cocaine money. And so oftentimes, like I think somebody noted that, you know, it's very hard to tell the difference between like wealthy people who like quote unquote legitimately made their wealth like dodging taxes and like proceeds from like heroin and cocaine money, because the mechanisms for laundering the money are identical. So like, you
yeah.
know, and you know, there's no kind of like it's made invisible. So, you know, I think that kind of says something about like the merging of the tactics of both these worlds in
Yeah.
way like the entire global capitalist kind
I
of
mean,
economy is like a big racket in a
it
way.
is
Like,
interesting how they say like the consequence is a significant number of unrecognized states across the globe. These states cut off from normal international commerce, often under constant military threat and commonly located in relatively underdeveloped regions, provide a ready territorial base for criminal activity. Right? So it seems to be like kind of
that's
locating them
true.
primarily in like underdeveloped regions.
Right.
Right?
Like the global
Like which
south kind of areas. Yeah.
yeah, which like maybe is like certainly there are like unrecognized states or would be states that like exist in like I don't know, like yeah, the global south. But I feel like this is also definitely a phenomenon in the like quote unquote developed world as well.
Yeah, and if you follow the
like a
money,
huge extent.
it's totally, it's all connected, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like if there's a so-called
Exactly. Yeah, I think that
parastate in
like
the
they're thinking
DRC,
about like I don't know, like yeah, and the example they give is like one of the clearest cases of early parapolitics is the involvement of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo in clandestine opium trade. Manchukuo was carved by the Japanese Kwantung Army in 1932 from Manchuria and parts of Inner Mongolia, which had been under Chinese sovereignty. It was internationally recognized only by Japan's allies and became a key player in the international illegal narcotics trade. Okay. But I don't know. I just feel
it's actually the more closely I read this first essay, the more I'm like, what are you actually talking about?
It almost seems like in their view, like parapolitics is the study like not of like, they did mention groups like I don't know, like the Safari Club or the Greek KYP, right? Pakistan's
P2.
ISI. It's interesting that they would say like Pakistan's ISI, their intelligence services, but not the United States CIA.
I guess it's like implied that like they're talking about MI6 and like CIA and like
but they
the big
mentioned the
intelligence
Safari Club and like all these groups in Opus Dei and P2, but they don't mention the CIA.
Well, I guess maybe they're specifically talking about groups that are not like government organizations that nonetheless like are powerful conclaves that are connected
but
to
the
like
ISI
institutional
is
power.
a government organization.
No, you're right. Then he shouldn't throw in the ISI with that as well. Yeah, it's a little bit muddying the waters a little bit. Because like the P2 was like an illegal Freemasonic lodge in Italy. It wasn't like an official organization. And
right. So yeah, it kind of seems like it's like parapolitics is mostly the study of like Hamas. Like,
I think they're fixated on parapolitics like concerning groups that are considered like illegal or criminal in some way, and like so that's why it's parapolitical to talk about Manchukuo, because they were involved in the clandestine opium trade, but they're like a sort of a parastate that was involved in drugs. So that's
and I think that there's
it is
about,
there's
opium
like
trade in Afghanistan and like the like I assume the U.S. involvement in that, although I didn't read the essay myself.
Right. Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And
so like I assume that's what the essay is about. I mean, I know that obviously there was a huge involvement, but I assume that the essay is about that. But it's interesting because like you kind of think of I guess maybe what you're kind of saying is that there's a lack of like kind of a politics like to it, or like a political valence to it.
Well,
where
there's
like,
a politics is conspicuously absent from this. Like I guess their final statement is that parapolitics then is the study of criminal sovereignty, of criminals behaving as sovereigns and sovereigns behaving as criminals in a systematic way.
So
it is not just a topic, but an analytical conclusion. But what's the conclusion? Like, I don't. That's a little too vague. I don't know.
Yeah, I think actually we should like read the structure or contradiction part, because this is like maybe we read some of this last time, right? But I want to kind of like revisit at least like this idea in this second section of structure or contradiction, because it's interesting. I guess it comes back to our like original point that like there isn't really a political valence to like this concept of parapolitics per se. There isn't really a stable concept of parapolitics, I would say, but like certainly like there isn't like a clear political valence to it, whether like right wing, left wing, or any kind of like even whether you want to use even the right wing, left wing framework or not. I think it can be applied like in a lot of different to a lot of different political ends.
Right.
But anyway,
especially in this essay,
this is interesting about structure or contradiction. These observations on the historicity of parapolitics highlight a key unresolved tension within the parapolitical approach. Scholars of parapolitics are united in asserting that parapolitics is not simply a collection of strange tales from the margins of politics which serve only to mark out the extreme limits of human behavior. That is to say, parapolitics does not blame rogue elements or evil geniuses, even though the subject matter of the approach is abundantly peopled with colorful characters. Rather, it examines global political, social, and economic structures to identify those features that permit or encourage the growth and maintenance of parapolitics. The assumption implies, incidentally, that parapolitics will be remedied, if at all, by structural and policy changes rather than by the pursuit of miscreants. Although prosecution may well, there's some typos here. Prosecution may well play some role in this process. Remediation, however, does not have a significant place in the parapolitical research agenda. All right. Nonetheless, yeah,
fair enough. Fair enough. I guess that's I guess complimentary to say that when it's not just about bad guys, even though a lot of people we talk about are very interesting and weird, etc.
Yeah, I guess like this assumption like that they take is like parapolitics will be remedied by structural and policy changes, not by the pursuit of miscreants.
Fair.
But
I
it
mean,
might happen, but remediation does not yet have a significant place in the parapolitical research agenda. So maybe eventually. Okay.
Well, this is before QAnon, when
right. Nonetheless, the historical discussion of parapolitics above suggests that it exists at the ragged intersection of political theories. Thus, the intervention of state security intelligence apparatuses to manipulate public opinion lies at the uncomfortable discontinuity between democratic theory and theories of opinion management. Similarly, the role of state regulation in creating niches for crime may refer simply to the limits of state authority and to the tension between recognizing the important public goods that the legal system normally brings to society and the fact that laws tend to reflect and defend the interests of the powerful. Likewise, the existence of unrecognized states clearly reflects a tension between the rival principles of state sovereignty and national self-determination. So this is interesting. This is what they say is the central question in parapolitics. The central question in parapolitics is, however, the extent to which moments of historical opportunity, prohibition, the Cold War, environmental regulations have permitted the emergence of structures that have become embedded in national and global systems. In other words, to what extent have criminal organizations, that is, organizations based in illegal trade and or organizations which seek to subvert the democratic process by illegal means, acquired some or even most of the important functions of governmentality? Specifically, we ask whether the resort of state security intelligence organizations to the assassination of political enemies and the calculated manufacture of public alarm warrants a greater acceptance of Tilley's proposition that the modern state has its roots in a firm form of protection racket. States emerge as powerful institutions which extracted wealth from those they controlled, returning little but the promise to limit the extent of plunder and to keep other plunderers at bay. I mean, yes. We asked whether state authorities manage the barrier between crime and non-crime precisely in order to create opportunities for organized crime. We asked whether the existence of unrecognized states in various parts of the world, far from being a product of systemic failure, is the product of unrequited tensions between sovereignty and self-determination. Might not they're actually saying it's not that. Far from being a product of systemic failure, a product of unrequited tensions between sovereignty and self-determination might not instead be a key part of a world system characterized by a pronounced division of labor between different territories and the increasing challenge to some traditional states from the transnational forces. Some of that I definitely
I agree with more of that, and also maybe
but some of it also I feel like is like questionable. Like the central historical question is like whether these sort of regulations, right, or I guess the Cold War, prohibition, and environmental regulations. I mean, I don't doubt that like those two things definitely create opportunities for criminality. Absolutely, that is true. But
in the case of especially the Cold War, you can't separate like the political questions of that, the political dimensions of that from like opportunities for criminality, because like the criminals were oftentimes like enlisted in the Cold War to like fight on a certain side. That was usually like the American side, So to act like, oh, it's like a thing that happened like separately and they're like, oh, hey, we could like take advantage of this. Like I don't know. It's not like fucking like Angleton like meeting with Lucky Luciano and be like, we need your help, or something like that, like 1943. It's much more entangled. However, I think I think they're right. Like a key part of the world system characterized by a pronounced division of labor between different territories, and even the increasing challenge of some traditional states from transnational forces. I could agree with that if by transnational forces we're kind of talking about like the global capitalist like market octopus sort of itself, eroding the sovereignty of like any one nation to like resist it. I think that is a dynamic of the neoliberal era. the challenge to some traditional states from the transnational forces. I do agree with that in a certain sense, but not in this kind of like disconnected, oh, a parastate is just like challenging somebody and there's like no greater context to it. Like, I'm interested in that from, perhaps these transnational forces are either something that was like acutely fostered by, some outside greater force to like say destabilize certain traditional states, right? Like you think about all the mercenaries like flooding into Libya in 2011. Like that was kind of a transnational parastate force. And now I would definitely classify Libya as sort of like a parastate, like certainly a failed state in many respects. But like that didn't just happen. You know what I mean? Like that was a plot. People did that. Like NATO did that. The United States did that. The CIA, the MI6, like all these different groups and actors. And I feel like that is I think that's it's helpful to keep in mind that, I don't know, it's not just like a natural effervescence of like things just played out this way now that like automatically states are being destabilized. Like,
I don't think that's necessarily what they're saying, though. I think that they're saying that they're doing it like intentionally, that they're like creating this environment on purpose, in order to, I don't know what their goal is, but they're doing it deliberately, in order to, I guess maybe they elaborate later, like
maybe they do. I'm thinking about earlier when they kind of set up this like oppositional thing of like parastate v state, and like that and just as that vague concept, I'm like, I don't know about that. But if you're talking about this in the broader sense, I guess I'm kind of gesturing to, I think the only term that I've coined like on the show at all, which is my sort of like nascent developing theory of anarcho-colonialism, of maybe like a historical like evolution from neo-colonialism, which actually like instead of controlling governments sort of like indirectly, perhaps parapolitically, through parapolitical means, to keep a state like with say a military, like a right-wing military dictator, so that you can kind of like reliably exploit their resources and not have them turn socialist, blah blah blah. And then I think what you started to see, like going into the 1990s, was actually a kind of shift towards just sort of wrecking states and making them not states anymore, or like parastates, or making them shells of states, basically. Even ones that had been like allies, even deep parapolitical allies like Liberia, were just kind of like, we'll just like let it burn, basically. But it wasn't just let it burn and let's walk away because we don't want like care about it or want to spend money on it. It opened up all these new opportunities, and there was definitely like a certain level of like consciousness with, I think, a lot of the invisible hands and actors that were like stoking the conflict there to actually not resolve it. And I think similarly in many other regions where you had kind of like this civic breakdown, this legal breakdown, right? And it was very much kind of a like not every little bit of it was like stage managed by outside forces, but the conditions for it were definitely fostered by outside forces. And I think there's kind of something they would like get out of it. And you can see it today with like then what has happened to Libya, what's happened to Syria, what's happened to Yemen, and what's happening to Ukraine right now, where you get the sense that as much as they love waving that trident flag and say, going Slava Ukraini and blah, 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 we got to give them weapons forever. Like they seem almost like very oddly and disturbingly at peace with the fact that like Ukraine is like going to be a bombed out wasteland now for like, however many years, and like has been materially like pummeled and like almost annihilated, like all of its infrastructure, millions of people have fled and all this stuff. And like, they don't seem to mind that because Ukraine always was like a hub of like international kind of like mafia criminal activity that bled over into like the official political world, like Hunter Biden, and all that shit. But really though, like Burisma, what the fuck? Like that is actually an example, I think, of the bleed over between, there's probably like, Odessa oil mafia, kind of money intermingled with blah, 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 with fixers in the West and et cetera. And I think it's not all just accidental. I think like the anarchification of like certain weaker states by transnational parastate forces is a play in the imperial playbook that has been called a lot in the 21st century. And I think they're kind of gesturing at it here a little more. I think they're kind of leaning into, key part of a world system characterized by a pronounced division of labor between different territories, So, if
I mean, I think that they would
Yeah.
agree that it's not like total, but I mean, I find this part to be interesting as well. And I mean, there's a lot of this that I think is like good and like and valuable. Like a lot of this I think is like fairly like on point in certain ways, but I don't know. I almost feel like it kind of goes back to what we were saying before about how it's like some of these people like will implicate like the people who are involved in these groups with Satan or whatever. And
Right,
even though I understand what they're saying and I agree with the point that they're actually making, I do think that this is kind of why I find ontological and epistemological questions so fascinating, because I feel like, this is all very like, this is the facts, like this is how it is, like, and it's not this and it's not that. And it doesn't really get into the question of like, okay, well, how do we define these things, and how does like, in what way is this actually spiritual? In what way does like belief actually play into these types of things? For instance, like I want to read this last part. I think you might have read this last time, but I think this is like really like a key thing. So he says, parapolitics then is the study of criminal sovereignty, of criminals behaving as sovereigns and sovereigns behaving as criminals in a systematic way. So that's a fascinating sentence to me, because again, it like pivots on this idea of like behavior, right? And also it's ontological, right? Like these people actually are criminals, but they're acting as sovereigns and they're not, so therefore like there's a dissonance between appearance
both of these
and
terms
reality,
depend on like the law
or
and
performance and reality, you could say.
Yeah.
And he says it is not just a topic but an analytical conclusion, like you read this before. On one hand, it goes significantly beyond the proposition that relations between security and intelligence organizations, international criminal networks, and quasi-states are occasional and incidental, the work of quote-unquote rogue elements and the like. That's true, right? I agree with that. On the other hand, it falls significantly short of grand conspiracy theory, it does not suggest that the world of visible, quote, normal politics is an illusion, or that it is entirely subordinated to deep politics. Well, first of all, I find this interesting because, like, okay, it would be subordinated to the politics that's deep, or like, I guess, beneath it, or like subterranean politics. So, like, it's kind of like almost like an as above, sub below type of thing, or it's like it's on top but it's on the bottom. But anyway, that's kind of besides the point. What I want to point out is that yes, it is. Yes, it is, or it's an incomplete picture. Like it is an illusion. Like visible normal politics is an illusion.
Like practically, I feel like it makes the most sense to say it's pretty much an illusion.
At
like
least
not
illusory,
literally everything, but
like it's kind of like, okay, if you see like a magic trick, it's not an illusion that there's like the bird is like not a robot or something. Like there's a real bird. The bird's really there, but like the appearance that the bird has like been pulled out of a hat or like appeared from behind like in a vanishing cabinet or something. That's the illusion, right? So like it can be, there's like if it's something's an incomplete picture. Right. Or like saying like makeup, like makeup doesn't like change your face into someone else's face completely. There's like illusionistic components to it. Right.
Right.
And also like if deep politics are or quote unquote deep, again, like I find like I'm kind of thinking of Derrida here, where he talks about like the play of quotation marks in his book Of Spirit about Heidegger, because like I always find it very interesting when people like pull out quotation marks. And I think like, okay, so they say normal politics. So then are you saying that there isn't a normal politics? It seems like you are saying that. You're saying that there isn't a quote unquote, it's not a quote unquote. You're actually saying that there is normal politics. It isn't illusory and isn't just a quote unquote idea, but it's something that it is real.
Yeah.
And then
partially it's like like he would, I guess he's asserted, it's or he's saying parapolitician or parapolitical analyst would say that it's like, it's influenced by deep politics, or like like entangled with deep politics, but not entirely subordinated. Whoa, you sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist. Like,
I don't think that like, that should be. I almost found the thing that was before about how like people mention space aliens or Satan. Like that is almost a more coherent and like persuasive distinction than the one that's being made here, because like even though this one's supposed to be a bit more refined and like and clearer and a bit less glib, I feel like now like once you leave it beside the kind of the affect of it, the kind of like the sort of like the basically the the basically like an affect element or the kind of a emotional element or the sort of aesthetic part of it, right? Where it's like then it's like, okay, well, it's kind of about like leaving a domain of normal politics that exists and isn't totally subordinated to deep politics. But I guess it's not about subordination, but it's about inextricability, right? Because he does say that it's systematic, extensive, and influential.
Well, he actually
then
invokes a term I've heard thrown around before, the tripartite relationship between security and intelligence organizations, international criminal networks, and quasi-states. That's what he says is systematic, extensive, and influential.
Yes.
And
So
the task of parapolitics as a discipline is to identify the dynamics of that relationship and to delimit precisely the influence that it has or does not have on public politics. Okay.
yeah, I guess this is actually kind of like on a little bit better on this sentence is a little bit better. I think it's more on even footing because it's now two categories of public politics versus parapolitics. But again, I think that's kind of getting into almost a different definition of parapolitics in a way.
I'm more comfortable with like public politics is like some kind of modifier, but not normal is I mean he puts normal, but he puts deep in
or like
quotes
politics
too.
in theory or something, like
like apparent politics, like exoteric politics or something like that. Like the show that is put on, the performance, that is put on for all of us. Like it's it could, when they speak they lie, when they are silent they are stealing. Like it's it's always kind of been that way.
At this point I don't even think that like it's that secret. Like I almost think that like some
it's a
of the
widely
stuff
held belief,
about, especially like for instance, like they they're referring to a lot of the time like the examples people will acknowledge are like not in the United States, right? But still, like a lot, like even
we got a pretty high clown show thing going on right now, like in our
people
politics.
know like a lot of like a lot of like things like this, the tripartite relationship. There's a lot of examples of that like I think everyone would agree are real. They were using like a lot of examples before that I think that even like an MIT journalist would acknowledge like a real political phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
So then how is that separate from like what's public? I don't know. Like, So I think that, I don't know. I feel like there's a little bit of, I agree with that.
Well, there's still, it falls
something
short of
not being said, which is like the issue, like the grand conspiracy theory issue, which is like that this is all really, I feel like burdened and like haunted by like the anxiety around like the stigma of like conspiracy theory. That's
still
like
see the
I feel like
defensiveness around
tortured
it
in this way.
Like no, like take me seriously. It falls significantly short of grand conspiracy theory. It doesn't suggest like wacky straw man, blah blah blah. But also like the thing that he cites as what grand conspiracy theory would do is suggest that the world of visible normal politics is an illusion and is entirely subordinated to deep politics. Now I know that, like, I kind of know the type of conspiracy theorist he's like probably has in mind, and like there definitely are people that do like take it in that direction. Whether it's QAnon wasn't around back then, but you still had your kind of like cranky, like everybody works for the UN, like they're all in on it together, like kind of like a Pat Robertson New World Order. Like that was a kind of version of there's a cabal, they're all in on it sort of thing. That obviously it's like that's not our analysis. And it's kind of what he describes, like what we do. Okay, we describe the relationship between these networks and then try to identify the dynamics of the relationship and delimit precisely how much influence it has or doesn't on like the show that we all see, right? And like how much can it reveal about the reality. Yeah, but anyways, there's some interesting things here. Again, like the sovereigns and criminals, like who defines that? Like kind of a little bit of a subjective label, both of those things, right? Like one person's criminal is another person, one person's illegitimate tyrant is another person's sovereign. Like, and so but so there's a mixture of things that are like, okay, cool. I think this is helpful, and then others that aren't. But maybe we should move on now to like the other essays, because I think we dug pretty deep into his. The next one has some interesting stuff about the Sicilian mafia and a lot of things, about deep structure. This is by Eric Wilson, I guess one of the editors of this volume, Deconstructing the Shadows. I think you wanted to read from this last time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it starts off with a what they call a joke, an absurd statement. Law is the respectable face of crime, but they go pretty deep into like anthropological stuff, and like they
Yeah.
talk a lot about the kind of the idea of like the power broker or the middleman, and that kind of they cite as an example, sort of like the Don, in like the Sicilian mafia or the capo.
Yeah, there's definitely some interesting like material here. This is what he has to say about parapolitics in particular. He uses Peter Dale Scott's definition, right? So parapolitics is a lurking presence to all the chapters of this volume. Peter Dale Scott has provided the formal definition of this quote shadow presence. Again, we'll just read the definition again that Peter Dale Scott is given. System or practice of politics in which accountability is consciously diminished. 2, generally covert politics, the conduct of public affairs not by rational debate and responsible decision making, but by indirection, collusion, and deceit. CF, conspiracy. 3, political exploitation of irresponsible agencies or parastructures such as intelligence agencies. Just as politics is a field, political science, studies the overt politics of the public state, so parapolitics is a field, studies the relationships between the public state and the political processes and arrangements outside and beyond conventional politics. Again, like, I guess maybe the field that I don't know enough about is political science. Like, what you're talking about, how we didn't go to J school, so we don't get the sense of like, the the reverence that they have for like, these like sus sources in the CIA. But like,
Right.
I don't understand like how, if is political science really just like about like, like politics and theory, or like doesn't talk about like the relationship of like intelligence agencies or like, nebulously legal networks and things like that. And
Apparently
like
not. Like that's
seems like that's what, seems what I'm
that's
getting
the impression
here.
I get from this essay, because they're all popping shots off at like normative, like poli-sci and international relations. And I think, yeah, that's what any public figure I've ever seen who's been like I'm like a political science, like, they have like a master's degree in like poli-sci, or, I think even, people in like undergrad that were like poli-sci majors. And I was always like interested in politics, but I caught like a whiff of like something's weird about poli-sci in particular. Like, it's not like studying history and learning lessons from it about like politics. It's like this weird like theory game.
History is much better as a discipline than political science, I think.
Yeah.
It's got that vibe of like, it's not like,
they learn about like game theory analysis, shit
exactly.
Like it's weird.
Like,
it's like a technocratic, like strange, like
exactly,
bloodless.
Just the idea of like calling it like political science, like you're trying to, kind of.
There's
like,
only one political science I would get a master's degree in. You know what I'm saying? Like,
right. Yeah. Well, I mean,
all others are fake.
Yeah, I mean, it shows how like for whatever reason, there's this like cult of the concept of science, even though science is just like something that kind of means knowledge. But it's like this idea that like what's scientific is like, so much more valuable than what's not, even though like, anything can really be called a science, but
in a way, it's almost like
it
is what you might be able to, I mean, it's called a social science, but you could almost call it a parascience, because not just in the sense that it's like not exactly like a hard science, but also that it like kind of hides its true nature by like pretending to be science, like serious science, but it's actually a deeply political, like politically charged and specific kind of like indoctrination about like thinking about like, being a Western capitalist.
I would
like,
turn around with
leader.
the exact same critique that I had of the idea of parastates and of parapolitics in general, which is that like, why like all sciences like are parasciences. It's entirely based on like epistemology and like power, and like who determines, like who has the authority to decide like what's a science and what's not.
Right.
Like, anyway, but however, conventional, or maybe that was, I don't even know if I'm like applying a political science framework and saying that. I guess probably not. It's probably more critical theory, but anyway, I think that political science would probably not like their discipline being undermined in that way. But anyway, like I feel like that's really what's determinative is like and I mean, maybe this is kind of like a Rancierian parapolitics to say that this like, is a function of power, but in my assessment, it is. But anyway, so, however, conventional or liberal political science assumes the normalcy of the state, both in its constitutional and its normative dimensions, as a given, and studies political phenomena from the perspective of the state. Parapolitics, in contrast, constitutes a radically nominalist critique of conventional political studies. Parapolitics uses the varying levels of interaction between conventional states and quasi-statist entities as the basis for formulating an analytical perspective that privileges neither the state nor its alternatives as legitimate international actors. Although of no determinative political bias, parapolitics does foster a basic skepticism regarding the coherence of orthodox liberal understandings of the state. This analytical perspective also serves to critique the purportedly self-grounding principles of recognition offered by the doctrine of effectiveness. In this context, the term parapolitical structure does not connote an essence, but nominally denotes an entity possessing cognizably political characteristics that can validly serve as an object within the study field, or paradigm of parapolitics. In turn, it is the observable and traceable patterns of constructive interaction between political and parapolitical structures that validates parapolitics' foundational hypothesis of the inherently covert nature of the state. Parapolitics' recognition of criminal sovereignty is signified by its location of status and parastatus interaction at the center of national security. The successful conduct of extralegal activity within this domain is not of incidental but of primary importance to the state. It would not be an exaggeration to claim that such interactions serve as one of the defining motors of the formation of national security policy, the hallmark of the parapolitical dual state that is simultaneously legal and extra-legal. To express it in wholly pedestrian terms, why is it exactly that states always seem to require back doors? Simply put, parapolitics constitutes a continuation of both political science and international law by other means. So that paragraph I like. I like on the whole, I like, I generally like that framework, again, I think that I get that argument. I see how this term can be a valid tool. That's what I kind of liked about this essay. I feel like it's much more I don't know, it makes a much more persuasive argument in that way. Right. And it does seem to be I guess it comes through a disciplinary quibble where it's I guess that political science just really sucks. And just really doesn't, and just really analyzes things through their constitutional and normative dimensions and doesn't actually deal with reality and only orthodox liberal understandings of the state.
It's very just normie pilled about everything and not
I guess because
I feel
a lot of
not
people who study
about.
Yeah, I mean, it really gets into academic politics in a way, because I guess what you probably observed, and what I feel we both observe about poli-sci people is that those people aspire to be state adjacent to the state. They want to be involved with the administrative state in some way, right? They
it's a good
want to
career
be the
track for
Kissingers
that.
of tomorrow,
right?
Right. They don't just want to be professors or poets or whatever, or podcasters. Usually they want to be
right. You could look at the Kennedy School of Government, that which is kind of a grooming.
One of the things ever,
one of the where Fetterman went, before he was mayor. But that is kind of a grooming institution, and that basically is poli-sci. I mean, basically, but I think a little more geared towards really prepping these people to go into institutions and assume kind of more prestigious roles in managing various bureaucracies and things like that. But it's all it's fun. It is interesting how shrouded it is in a kind of just neutral, objective, hey, we're just some scientists in lab coats observing politics and deriving scientific principles from it. We got no dog in this fight. Unlike the Marxist Leninist Institute in Moscow, where Theraman went when he was 80 to get a master's degree, so they let him into the party. Our version of that is just teaching about the principles of government and I don't know, technocratic things and smart new paradigms like game theory and shit like that you can just plug and play in to make the government more optimized, and also probably just a lot of lightly laundered neoliberal ideologies that just shape your it'd be fun to get a syllabus from there and really go through it and be how are they grooming these young people to become, because you see how they when they pop out of schools like that, they're kind of a certain way. And I think that's what everyone in this book is clapping back against. He writes that one of the basic premises of Government of the Shadows is that parapolitical structures are neither, quote, parasitic nor deviant, but functionally central to the routine operation of global governance and private authority. this is argued by Peter Dale Scott in his contribution. Yeah. So, I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think that is like a strong point to make. And I think it's to their credit that they make it that, yeah, this isn't about like, oh, this, like these criminals have like gotten a free ride. Like somehow they snuck in and like they're doing bad stuff. Or it's like there was just some crazy bastards that we got to get behind and figure out why they such bastards. Like sometimes history just produces these bad guys and stuff like that. These are not deviations from the norm. This is like it's constitutive of the system and like necessary for the system. The question of like how necessary is a little more of an open one that I think a lot of our work is trying to like pin down a little more specifically, right? Like because I think when the last essay dismissed this idea that like, oh, everything's subsumed, they're not these crazy conspiracy theorists who think that everything in normal politics is subsumed by deep politics. But, I think it's actually a valid question of like, I don't think we know exactly. Like, it's hard for me to give a confident estimate of like what percentage of quote unquote normal politics is actually just like straight up controlled by parapolitical forces or, like secret parapolitical forces. Like, it's some percent, like, across, various things, right? But, I'm also not saying like 100%. Like it's
there's
a little wiggle room in there, but that's what like investigating it kind of bears out, and maybe it's like different in different circumstances, right? I mean, and maybe in other countries, in some countries, like everything is very tightly managed by a kind of like nominally like secret or unofficial kind of a ruling order or something, right? In other countries, it's like very overt, and maybe there's more influence by like the sort of like para element in various countries. Though I think it's probably deeper than we would think in most, right? Given the global economic system being the way it is, like that's another argument a lot of people do make in this whole book. I think he says that the most obvious and perhaps most important nexus between parapolitics and the ostensibly liberal state is the marketplace. Arguably, national parapolitical systems exist and are implicitly tolerated, if not actually encouraged, in order to provide both extra-statist and extrajudicial and extrajuridical regulation of underground or shadow economies. So exactly, like the marketplace is central to all this, and we live in a world, pretty much a world market system in the post-Cold War. This is what prevailed in the early 90s, and everything was kind of like had to be integrated, even China, by that point, with some very rare exceptions. Like pretty much every point in the world was open for penetration by the neoliberal global market system.
Yeah. I like this this part of this essay, because this actually kind of gets into I think what we were mentioning before, like Peter Dale Scott's like critique of his own concept of parapolitics, or like his of his use of the term, right? So he says Arlaki's significant comment, for all their conflicts with part of the state apparatus, talking about mafia entrepreneurs. He's like writes this is Arlaki, another scholar who's quoting. He says, for all their conflicts with part of the state apparatus and with the non-mafia elements in their entrepreneurial elite, they feel themselves to be members of the ruling class and have come to realize that their needs require appropriate political expression. So actually, I'll just read this intervening paragraph. This is pretty interesting here. A global economic system premised upon ceaseless capital accumulation exacerbates irrational economic drives in both the official and underground economies, right? Official, I think, and non-official is a more valuable framework too, because certainly there is an official discourse and there's one that's non-official. But anyway, historically, mafia because you can definitely speak of that, right? Historically, mafia-type entrepreneurial activity was constrained by the inherent imbalance between the rapid pace of capital accumulation and the restrictive narrowness of territorial markets. However, now that the mafia's activities obey forces tending towards a ceaseless expansion of power, this balance of generational succession has been disturbed, and continual conflict between mafiosi has become inevitable. So yeah, this is what I wanted to read. But I do want to say, like, yeah, it is interesting because like this like official and non-official, but in a way, like one kind of requires the other. It's kind of like the state of exception in a way. But anyway, so he goes on. Arlaki's significant comment, for all their conflicts with part of the state apparatus, attains an even deeper resonance when read in conjunction with Scott's notion of the parapolitical. Both parapolitics and predatory entrepreneurialism signifying expanding orbits of the economically and politically irrational. In his more recent writings, Scott has come to see the parapolitical as a free-floating sign of political irrationality not expressly circumscribed by statist forms. The investigation of parapolitics, which I defined with the CIA in mind as a system or practice of politics in which accountability is consciously diminished, I see value in it as a definition as a mode of analysis. But parapolitics as thus defined is itself too narrowly conscious and intentional. It describes at best only an intervening layer of the irrationality under our political culture's rational surface. Thus, I now refer to parapolitics as only one manifestation of deep politics. All those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, which are usually repressed rather than acknowledged. Right? So
that was a direct Peter Dale Scott quote.
Yeah. So he says, like, note how Scott's concept of deep politics parallels the honor culture of Hess's Parastates mafiosi. Honor is both irrational and deeply determinative. Read in the strongest sense, deep politics directly echoes Schopenhauer's parodic inversion of Hegel's metaphysics. The real is the irrational is the real. Through its convergence with the more generic illiberal political irrationality, deep politics is dyadic to a globalized predatory entrepreneurialism, utilizing a paralogic of its own. So yeah, I find that like the aspect of like the irrationality to be like a very interesting like framework, and I think that like you can see like the poetry of Peter Dale's, like, you know, you can definitely tell he's a poet, and then he like definitely, you know, is able to like read that element of these things because like, you know, it's not just like a wonkish matter, you know, like there's more. I feel there's like, you know, the expression of it is like important, and there's more to it than, you know, simply like this kind of denominative thing of like, I don't know, parastates or like, you know, non-official states. And I think that this idea of like, you know, the real as the like, you know, the irrational or like you know, unspeakable or you know, unthinkable or unreasonable, like unable to be reasoned.
Well, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, it's this ontology epistemology problem that I think is so interesting.
It is interesting. I want to read this little last part just because it's Arlaki, but it's an interesting point he makes. This is a quote directly from him that says, "If the mafioso's entrepreneurial activity is marked at once by an economic rational dimension and by an aspect that is irrational and extra economic, he is not alone in this. Far from progressively enlarging the sway of values and conduct of a rational capitalist type, the entrepreneurial practices of the mafiosi extend the domain governed by archaic and predatory practices." And so Arlaki deliberately evokes Susan Strange's observations on the interpenetration of market with state forms. If the monist identity of the state has been fractured by parastructures and the market strives to operate in an extrajuridical manner, or juridical? Is that juridical?
Yeah, I guess juridical.
Oh, yeah.
Either,
Sorry. And is it monist or monist?
Monist is what I usually say.
Monist. Yeah, okay. If the monist identity of the state has been fractured by parastructures and the market strives to operate in an extrajuridical manner, then it is precisely those same parastructures that will strive to assimilate the potent but unpredictable extra-statist dimensions of the economy. And, quote, irresponsible economy serves as the natural habitat of irresponsible agencies. Conversely, if the world economy, an inherently irrational process of ceaseless capital accumulation, has truly penetrated everywhere, then the most successful predatory structures of capital accumulation will be able to evolve into, quote, legitimate forms of political agency. It's a chilling thought, but interesting, though. Well put, I think. And yeah, no, I like all this talk about like the mafia and like the hombre de respeto, like the man of respect. And because I think that's also what we try to talk about a lot, is like to make a little bit of space for like the irrational and also the phenomenon of like repressed history. And, you know, so I guess since we always put deep history or deep politics in our bio, I guess we're vindicated because I like deep politics better than parapolitics, even though parapolitics is fine, I guess, talking about maybe in a more micro or specific kind of sense. Like one dimension of deep politics is like parapolitical activity, I guess you could say. But deep politics is it's like,
and
yeah.
Yes, and I think that like what he's describing. I don't know if like again like the term parapolitics, it could mean a bunch of different things, but like when I hear deep politics, I think like okay, that's just politics but deep. It's not like saying this is a different category of politics,
right?
And that's like what I don't like.
There's a space between the two words.
Yeah, it kind of go back to the Geertz thing where it's like, oh, these are rational people, and like that actually creates this whole like thing where it's like, okay, I'm understanding everything. That's like the sort of opposite side of the problem, where like it's understanding all of these things through the prism of like the irrationality of people's like beliefs and the ethnic, humiliation and like psychology and like games and social dramas and things like that, and obviously that's not the complete picture either. Like that's obviously like, leads to serious like mistakes in apprehending the world, right? But I also think like I think that and putting that in the category of like the parapolitical, no, that's political, right? Like that's part of politics, and it's also part of, not just like individual people or like cultural psychologies or social dramas or things like that. Like those social dramas also play out like in the sort of the official state domain, like absolutely, and this is why like, beliefs like belief in Satan or anything like that do matter, whatever those beliefs are. I'm not saying that they are, overall, there's a widespread literal belief in like worshiping the devil in these in like state connected organizations or anything like that, and like or among like influential people, but like they certainly do have like beliefs that are satanic and like are incredibly sus in many ways. Like belief in AI gods, like, which to me is like not that discrete from like worshiping the devil. Like if you want to create like a false idol of of like language model bullshit and like worship it as like more intelligent and like having a greater soul or spiritual power than a human being and greater like intellect, which is supposed to be like that is that's evil.
Bad. That's bad. I'm not down with that.
Well, at least I think to make it to take a value judgment away, I certainly think that is relevant to understanding politics in the world. That people like have those beliefs.
It'd be one thing if it's just some random person out there that dreams of building an AI god like in their garage, but like isn't actually going to do it. Like, and like the most powerful, wealthy, influential like weirdos that you've ever seen, that own like our media platforms and the social media
like
we'll
interact on. DMT gin that they want to like make friends with.
Yeah, we don't even know what fucking cults they're in. Like they're in cults. Like
come on,
the irrationality has to be factored in. Whether they've tricked themselves or they're weirdos or they've been groomed or they're psyoped, who knows? Or it's just like the inner darkness of the psyche whispering in their hearts, who knows? But whatever it is, it's bad. So I think if you want to call it satanic,
bad, actually.
Everyone should just chill out and let us call it satanic. I want to read another paragraph here because I think he's like he kind of is spitting. He introduces another term which is maybe a decent one. We'll see. He says, this book deliberately employs the phrase shadow governance in relation to parapolitical structures as a way to highlight the centrality of covert action for international politics, what might be deemed as the continuation of informal empire by other means. It is in this sense, and this sense only, that, quote, conspiracy theory is a topic of concern for the contributors to this volume. Stripped of its speculative and sensationalist armature, conspiracy theory stands revealed as the merely self-consciously parapolitical realization that covert agencies and actions are an integral part of the practical exercise of governance within both national and transnational spaces. Global governance is never politically neutral or morally innocent, as it is always highly prone towards the fostering of deep politics, even within its most innocuous forms. Throughout the late 20th century, there has been a noticeable move from the hierarchical, territorial, and bureaucratic relations of government to more polyarchical, non-territorial, and networked relations of governance. A primary example of this is what Duffield has labeled the liberal peace, which is, quote, I think I might have read this before, but we'll read it again. Part of the complex, mutating, and stratified networks that make up global liberal governance. More specifically, liberal peace is embodied in a number of flows and modes of authority within liberal governance that bring together different strategic complexes of state, non-state, military, civilian, and public-private actors in pursuit of its aims. Such complexes now variously enmesh international NGOs, governments, military establishments, IFIs, private security companies, IGOs, the business sector, and so on. They are strategic in the sense of pursuing a radical agenda of social transformation, i.e., quote, developmentalism, in the interests of global stability. In the past, one might have referred to these complexes as representing the development or aid industry. Now, however, and this is in italics, they have expanded to constitute a network of strategic governance relations that are increasingly privatized and militarized. Damn right. Within this general convergence of strategic complexes and parapolitical structures, it is the element of, quote, private that most concerns us, causing a transversal shift from licit to illicit or shadow forms of governance. So yeah, I think he's kind of spitting there. I think a network of strategic governance relations that are increasingly privatized and militarized is like a good description of kind of a what you could call deep political networks, I guess. Like strategic, like these things that really do like they kind of involve like all these different kind of orgs and organizations, both public and private, military and civilian. Then you have like mercenary company. You have like Eric Prince running around. Did you see his group chat got leaked?
No, I didn't.
It'll probably be a little outdated by the time people hear this, but no, it was like a 500-person group chat that had like, a few like Congress people and like Tucker and a bunch of random weirdos, and also like the grandson of a Nazi general in it who lives in like Chile and it was like really popular, like posting there all the time. But like what the Western democracy needs, like they need to wake up and like do what needs to be done. Like just some like weird ass like, Nazi grandchild. But then it got like exposed, and I mean they're all kind of like hyping about. Speaking ominously about like patriots doing something if like Trump doesn't win, like Mike Flynn's in there, that, but that's a group I'd like be a little bit worried about because, Eric Prince does all kinds of weird shit around the world. He's a busy boy, and that is increasingly like those are the types of people, the sort of the middlemen, right? The brokers that kind of move in the shadows and kind of like grease the wheels of this like vast system of ceaseless capital accumulation. And this is actually interesting. The next part here, as we've already discussed, this is about the mercantile companies. As we've already discussed, successful, quote, state building within the Eurocentric core zone of the modern world system was invariably equated with the successful monopolization of violence within a specific territory, coupled with a self-sustaining collection of protection rent, either in the form of primitive tribute or rationalized taxation. Those are in quotes. What is generally underappreciated is the degree to which the currently asymmetrical world system operates with the, quote, trace of a more primitive but highly efficacious world system of private authority and governance established by the great mercantile companies of the 17th century. The political and economic realities of the early modern period served as sufficient grounds for legitimizing the status of the trading companies, such as Grotius's Dutch East Indies Company, the VOC, as an autonomous military and therefore political force. Pivotal to the global success of the VOC was the systematic internalization of, quote, protective costs, the institutional integration of military and paramilitary activity within the lawful scope of company activities so as to ensure the secure transit of capital assets, guaranteed or, quote, forced access to new markets, and the efficient subsidization of costs through the enforced guarantee of advantageous rates of return on capital outlays. An exact counterpart of those contemporary international private security companies that constitute an outstanding example of Duffield's strategic complexes, the armed mercantile company efficiently subsidized, quote, low-intensity warfare, leading directly to the institutionalized, quote, overlapping of public and private functions. There's a quote from Duffield. The managers of the company, confronted with conflicting political and economic considerations, created a new kind of balance between non-economic means and economic ends. Against the demands of the participants, the directors carried through an aggressive policy, a policy of consolidation, and a policy of dividends. But they did not identify the company with the state, and they did not make the aim of the state their own. In the long run, they did not forget that the company was a privately owned business and that its owners were meant to make a profit. The result of this situation was a hybrid, neither a simple partnership for trade nor a state strategy. Profit remained the ultimate aim, but under conditions which tended to make the presentation and growth of the capital as important as, or more important than, the payment of demands. At least as early as 1609, but probably already in 1606, the Hierine XVII realized that the non-economic means might be used for economic ends, and that the acts of war in the East might be turned into a profitable investment, even if it might be a waste of time to combine the functions of soldier and merchant in one person. The company found that it was no waste to combine economic and non-economic activities in one enterprise. The instruments of violence under the control of the company were to some extent used for the purposes of organized plunder. They were in general used to safeguard and further economic activities, but they did not become an end in themselves. Interesting. And they also said, this is another quote, illicit wealth is dangerous because it is cumulative. With higher rates of return, it grows faster than legal. Because it is associated with the delegitimation of the state and the discrediting of the prevailing distribution of legal income and wealth in the eyes of the citizens, underground accumulation can go hand in hand with the general breakdown of social cohesion and the spread of more predatory forms of economic behavior. Legitimate wealth will then tend to imitate its behavior, seeking out higher rates of return in the underground economy and stashing surpluses in short-term, anonymous, and speculative assets rather than in long-term productive investment. Yeah, it sounds a lot like Russia in the 90s, honestly.
Yeah,
And,
it really made me want to read this guy's book about early modern Netherlands, I guess.
Is this Duffield?
Or Eric Wilson.
Oh,
The
Eric
Savage
Wilson.
Republic, the Indus of Hugo Grotius, Republicanism, and Dutch hegemony within the early modern world system. I think world systems theory is kind of interesting, like Brodel. I don't like, I feel like it's like a bit dated, but still kind of interesting. Definitely has some valuable ideas. I'm definitely interested in that period. I always wanted to read like for the show, Joost van den Vondel, his poem Lucifer, which is kind of written during, it's a Dutch or of his play Lucifer, which is like a Dutch play written during that time, which is kind of interesting, and it's sort of is about Amsterdam in the early modern period, but it's all kind of through an allegory about Lucifer, when God decides to elevate man above angels. Is just a synopsis Wikipedia. The high-ranked angel Lucifer initiates a revolt which ends when the archangel Michael ejects the revolters from heaven with a bolt of lightning. Lucifer then avenges himself on earth by seducing Adam and Eve to commit original sin, causing their banishment from the Garden of Eden. After the second performance on February 5th, the burgomeisters of Amsterdam, pressed by the clergy, banned further performances. Lucifer is widely regarded as Vondel's masterpiece and one of the greatest works of Dutch literature. It's one of the rare products of Dutch literature that occupies a steady place in the Western canon. But yeah, so I guess I think certain political meanings were perceived in it that caused it to be controversial.
Yeah, that does sound interesting. Yeah, all that old Dutch shit. I'm just gonna read the last part here, and then maybe we should jump to PDS after this.
Might be good. It might be good to read that play and this book by Eric Wilson, for one episode one day.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, just to sort of sum up this before we move on, he says that the point of this historical excursus has been to highlight the way in which the foundational conduits through which the modern world system evolved were, in the most generic sense, both, quote, private and corrupt, which is to say, parapolitical. As we have seen elsewhere, the 17th century provided an extensive staging ground for 21st century developments. Thanks to the global penetration of the capitalist world economy, the macro-level north-south vertical axis is now paralleled by micro-level divisions north to north and south to south. The shadow economies of the South constitute, quote, black holes of informational capitalism replicated globally throughout the world system. The emergence of an international informational capitalist class, generating ever higher levels of transnational convergence, increasingly leads to the criminalization of domestic structures and to an ever-widening collapse of the political into the parapolitical. The growing parallel linkages between North and South create new parapolitical structures to guarantee acceptable political outcomes in the absence of responsive or controllable state institutions. The more a state's vital interests are determined by extraterritorial factors, the greater the need for extrajuridical forms of covert action and deep politics. Yeah, he also talks about the sub-state, but I think, I think we want to give some time to our boy PDS further on in this book. It's actually this is a good one to read because it is kind of a greatest hits. Like there's so many cameos from, colorful SJ characters, a lot of familiar names that we've covered in the past. And actually, this is, I think, going to be good, very valuable stuff. A lot that is touched on for Contra 8, which is up next, because this is the whole gang is just about here, I think, in this article.
Yeah.
And we can stop if there's anything that jumps out at us where we feel like, but I think it's pretty good. We'll see. We're gonna apply our praxis now. This is Drugs, Anti-Communism, and Extra-Legal Repression in Mexico by Peter Dale Scott. And it doesn't say here what year this is from, so I'm pretty sure this must be after 9/11, so sometime in the 2000s he wrote this. Actually, probably closer to like when this was written, when this was released. I think he wrote it for this volume, perhaps. I don't know, but all right, let's go. Peter Dale Scott begins. The interaction between a government or society and a narco system is an engagement between a known system and a relatively unknown one, between a well-defined entity and a relatively amorphous milieu. In such a situation, language is inevitably biased towards narrating the interaction from the perspective of the documented government or society. Thus, in practice, we tend to say that, for example, Mexico has a narco system or narco economy. But of course, the verb has here is misleading. There is also a sense in which one could say the narco system has a government. All right. Here, too, the verb has does not begin to capture the complexity of the interaction. In the case of Mexico, a single narco system, quote, has, in this misleading sense, two or more governments. It has been shown to be capable of influencing the United States government, at times notoriously, as when it proved impossible for Washington to act meaningfully against the drug bank, Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. I don't know if we had talked about really the Mexican, there obviously were, anyways. But okay. By the 1980s, however, it can be argued that the narco system had come close to controlling the Mexican government, and that is the picture I shall present in this chapter. So first heading, the problem of drugs in Mexico. It is difficult in America to write authoritatively about Mexican politics, even in the last decade when it has become more fashionable to write about Mexico as a narco-democracy. Few, if any, authors address the American share of responsibility for the staggering corruption that has afflicted Mexican politics. In this chapter, I shall attempt to describe how the U.S. came to be allied with the drug traffic in Mexico in opposing left-wing political movements, much as it did in the same period in France and Italy. The key was a triarchic situation in which the Mexican drug traffic came to be partly managed and protected by the Mexican Federal Security Directorate, DFS, and the DFS in turn was partly managed and protected by its sister organization, the Central Intelligence Agency. I do not wish to suggest that Washington fully controlled this course of events. The DFS was not simply a CIA asset. However, it could not have operated with impunity for as long as it did, without ongoing CIA protection for its illegalities. And the CIA presence in the DFS became so dominant that some of its intelligence was seen only by American eyes, according to the famous Mexican journalist Manuel Buendia. Let me begin with a few facts not widely remembered. Mexican illegal drug traffic began around 1914 and grew out of three events, only one of which was Mexican. The first was the Mexican Revolution, which, quote, brought disorder and ungovernability to northern Mexico at about the same time that drug trafficking was outlawed in the U.S. The second was the Chinese Revolution, in which one faction, the Kuomintang, the KMT, was financed in part by global trafficking. This was done chiefly by Chinese secret societies, or tongs, in many nations, including Mexico and the U.S. The third, of course, was the passage of the Harrison Anti-Narcotics Act of 1914. At first, most of those involved in the Mexican drug traffic, quote, were Mexican residents of Chinese origin, although they were not the only ones. Their opium probably crossed the border in both directions. In 1931, a Mexican official reported his conclusion that the direction of the trafficking was more from the U.S. to Mexico than vice versa, and that both he and U.S. narcotics supervisor Harvey Smith thought that the large-scale traffickers resided north of the border. In the same year, a leader of a coast-to-coast Chinese tong in America, the Hip Sing, was arrested in a major drug bust that also netted the wife of Thomas Panaccio, Lucky Luciano's partner. Mexico was a traditional source of opium for medicines, American patent medicines, and eventually for supplementing shipments of illegal opium from Asia. But Mexican production increased with the interruption of Chinese opium exports after 1937. At the same time, the KMT received more U.S. protection and support from President Roosevelt. During and after the Second World War, the U.S. consciously used drug lords like Lucky Luciano and their access to violence as assets, eventually to combat communism, especially communist China. We shall see that in Mexico, too, the U.S. used both the Mexican DFS and their drug traffickers as assets for violence against the Latin American left. CIA protection for the DFS ended in 1985 after the DFS was implicated in the murder of a DEA agent. I think that is Kiki Camarena, who did. I think we discovered that like Felix Rodriguez, the murderer of Che, like literally like killed him in the 80s. Right. Like, yeah, under Max Gomez was his fake name. Anyways, but the institutional arrangements of the drugs DFS CIA triarchy survived, at least into the administrations of Carlos Salinas de Gortari from 1989 to 95, and his successor, Ernest Zedillo, who left office in 2001. To this day, these sordid connections are still mostly unmentioned in America. I have something funny to say about Carlos Salinas, that president. He is like he does not get focused on enough. He's an incredibly sus president, who I believe either his son or his nephew became, like, in more recent years, the head of like the Mexican branch of Nexium.
Oh,
like,
wow.
And he was like best buddies with George Bush. Like, they basically hatched NAFTA together. I think he might get into some of that, but he probably doesn't get into that came out more recently, that like it's because the Salinas brothers were both like in politics, and one of their sons ended up basically running the Mexican like branch of Nexium with Keith Raniere in like the peak, weird trafficking era, with the Bronfmans and who, did start out as bootleggers, lest we forget. But anyway, so he goes on. Though the DFS was closed down in 1985, its legacy has survived. When Carlos Salinas de Gortari became president of Mexico in 1989, the American press was almost unanimous in praising him. However, one of the few dissenters, Andrew Redding at the World Policy Institute, pointed to Salinas' appointment of Fernando Gutierrez Barrios to the position of Secretary of Government. That's Interior, basically. Quote, Gutierrez's public career originated in the Federal Security Directorate, DFS, where he rose through the ranks to become director in 1964. He was thus in charge of the DFS at the time of the 1968 massacre of several hundred peaceful student protesters in the Plaza of the Three Cultures, an event as deeply seared in the Mexican national consciousness as the Tiananmen massacre in the Chinese psyche. Redding then described the variety of specialized police and intelligence agencies that emerged under the aegis of the Secretariat of Government. And yeah, it talks about the Fernando Gutierrez Barrios and Javier Garcia Paniagua, Miguel Nazarjaro. That triumvirate was the force behind the formation of the White Brigade, a clandestine paramilitary police unit that was responsible for the disappearance of thousands of opponents of the regime between 1972 and 1980, of which more than 500 never reappeared. So he says this is all in all a rather depressing insight into a country where the American FBI, Army Intelligence, and CIA have exerted more influence and for a long time maintained larger staffs than anywhere else in the world. The CIA can be shown to have used its influence not to promote democracy in the public state, but to support and protect the countervailing and largely extra-legal, quote, deep state of top-down repression. So, for example, Gutierrez himself was, like other DFS officials, a high-level CIA asset with the cryptonym Lie Tempo 4. Wow. Even got his cryptonym. All right, got his ass.
Yeah.
All right, so then we're talking about the DFS CIA and drug traffickers. All right. So far, so good, you know. All right, we're getting some... He's taken us on a good journey, and he's got receipts. So from its beginnings in 1947, the DFS, set up with FBI assistance, developed a more and more institutional relationship with drug traffickers whose own cadres supplied recruits for off-the-books governmental violence. By the 80s, possession of a DFS card was recognized by DEA agents as a, quote, license to traffic in drugs. Quote, I guess maybe from a DEA guy. Using their DFS credentials as shields, agents regularly escorted narcotic shipments through Mexico and provided other services, frequently even selling seized narcotics to favored organizations. Later intelligence showed that the DFS embarked on an ambitious project to organize protection on a national scale, bringing as much of the nation as possible under a unified system. When DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena was murdered in Mexico in 1985, the subsequent investigation produced abundant testimony that the CIA, as well as the DFS, was protecting the top traffickers who were responsible. The DFS was nominally closed down in the wake of Camarena's murder and other drug scandals. The last two DFS chiefs were both indicted and eventually convicted. Miguel Nazarjaro in San Diego for smuggling stolen cars, and Jose Antonio Zaria Perez in Mexico for the 1984 murder of the investigative journalist Manuel Buendia. A new agency was created, the General Directorate of Political and Social Investigations. Okay. But it continued to issue protective badges to high-level traffickers. Both the FBI and CIA intervened to protest the 1981 indictment of Nazarjaro, claiming that Nazar was, quote, an essential contact for CIA station in Mexico City on matters of terrorism, intelligence, and counterintelligence. When Associate Attorney General Lowell Jensen refused to proceed with Nazar's indictment, the San Diego U.S. Attorney William Kennedy publicly exposed their intervention and was promptly fired. A pilot, Werner Lotz, a German pilot, testified that Contras were being trained on a ranch near Veracruz that was owned by the DFS-protected kingpin, Rafael Caro Quintero. Lotz and other eyewitnesses also spoke of money passed to the Contras from Caro's partner, Miguel Felix Gallardo. Their associate in Honduras, Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, owned an airline, Setco, which was picked by the CIA to be the main supply link to Contra camps on the Honduras-Nicaraguan border. In other words, the CIA, as well as the Mexican government, was consciously drawing on Mexican drug traffickers and their protectors as off-the-books assets, just as it was also doing in the 1980s in Afghanistan. Thus, a hierarchy of untouchability was established by which traffickers were protected and assisted by the DFS, and both in turn were protected by elements in the CIA. Mexican intelligence underwent a second reorganization in the wake of the DFS scandals, out of which emerged the Center for Investigations and National Security, or CSEN. Even after the fall of the PRI party from power in 2000, CSEN's reputation was only a little less tarnished than that of its predecessor. And the fact of continuing CSEN collaboration with the CIA and FBI was admitted in 2004 in connection with unpopular security procedures after 9/11. When Vicente Fox was elected in 2000, there were hopes that Mexico was beginning to emerge into a less corrupt and violent era. The presence of big drug cartels has, however, clearly survived the fall of the PRI, and some observers have predicted that, quote, Mexico is becoming the next Colombia. In 2006, there were reports that CSEN was fighting a, quote, dirty war in Chiapas and Guerrero that was reminiscent of the 1960s. Meanwhile, the LA Times reported hundreds of killings in Mexico in the last year are linked to the war between the Gulf Cartel and a Sinaloa-based group headed by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. The country's brutal drug war has increasingly been marked by the use of hand grenades, large caliber assault weapons, and paramilitary style attacks. Police and prosecutors are not simply killed, they are beheaded and put on public display. So, next section, the Mexican traffic, U.S. organized crime, and the CIA. We get some good. Oh, we get some big names here. All right, I think a lot from Contra 7. So he says that the CIA's involvement with drug traffickers in Southeast Asia was largely disclosed in the 70s when the U.S. disengaged from the region and the CIA distanced itself from its drug assets there. Meanwhile, in Mexico in the same period, drug trafficking, related state violence, and CIA involvement all radically increased. There have been no comparable revelations of CIA involvement with drug traffickers in Mexico and Latin America, but once again we can safely say that those at the very highest level of responsibility have been immune from prosecution. After World War II, Mexico was a principal way station in the smuggling of international opium and heroin into the U.S. and Canada. The Mexican traffic in the post-war years took place in a milieu that was, from its outset, dominated by important international players like the American Meyer Lansky, and they enjoyed a de facto immunity from the consequences of past collaborations with intelligence networks. Alfred McCoy, one of our best authorities on drug traffic, suggests a different picture. Describing Lansky's post-war entrance into the Mexican milieu through his Mexico City representative, Harold Meltzer, McCoy writes that, quote, Meltzer failed dismally in his bid to make Mexico a major supplier of opiates for American addicts. McCoy adds that Meltzer's group lacked Luciano's contacts and Lansky's finances. This is not what we learned from Meltzer's Federal Bureau of Narcotics biographies and Alan A. Block. Hey, shout out to the king. I was wondering if somebody in this book was going to mention him, but Scott does. All right. The former tells us that Meltzer was an associate of Meyer Lansky and a major figure in the organized underworld who, outside of the continental U.S., frequented, quote, Canada, Mexico, Cuba, Hong Kong, Japan, Hawaii, and the Philippines. Block writes that Meltzer was reportedly bankrolled by Lansky and Nig Rosen in a wide-reaching syndicate stretching from Mexico City to Havana, New York, and Los Angeles. There are, in fact, numerous official references at this time to a coast-to-coast drug ring involving both Havana and representatives in Mexico City. McCoy's chief evidence that Meltzer failed is Meltzer's arrest and subsequent conviction in 1949, but in this period of violent syndicate reorganization, there were many arrests and even murders of key players, notably that of Lansky's former intimate friend, Bugsy Siegel, an important figure in the post-war Mexican traffic who was overlooked by McCoy. Thus, arrests by themselves tell us little. Luciano was arrested and jailed in 1936, but clearly remained a dominant figure in the international narcotics underworld until his death in Naples in 1962. The CIA regarded Meltzer, like Luciano earlier, as a potential off-the-books asset. Around 1960, CIA officer William Harvey, assembling a file of potential assets for a CIA assassination capacity, ZR rifle, included Meltzer as a candidate. At the time, Meltzer was a, quote, a longtime collaborator and sometime shooter for John Rosselli, the central figure in the CIA's mafia assassination plots against Fidel Castro. Like McCoy, Peter Lupsha once belittled the Mexican drug traffic in the 40s. He depicted it as still controlled by regional bandidos, each dominating their local civic plaza, before, quote, the need for upper world political connections increased. A diametrically opposed viewpoint is expressed by Luis Astorga that high-ranking politicians have been connected to the Mexican drug traffic since its origins over a century ago. I'm going to go with the last guy, I think, on that one. Yeah. Astorga claims further that, from the outset, the majority of influential traffickers who were not members of the political class were political protégés, not the politicians' godfathers or controllers. It seems likely that before 1947 and the creation of the DFS, these relationships existed chiefly at the provincial level, especially in northern Mexico. Thus, we can say that whereas in Asia, the CIA helped to create and encourage the local intelligence drug connections of the 50s, in Mexico, it largely inherited them. So this is the origins of the CIA DFS drugs triarchy. He says there is general agreement, however, that with the U.S.-assisted creation of the DFS in 1947, a structural linkage was instituted between the ruling political class and the drug traffickers. Its work was to be twofold. On the one hand, it ensured that part of the profits was levied in exchange for protection. On the other, it served as a mechanism for containing violence and any political temptations on the part of the traffickers. The brains behind the creation of the DFS, President Aleman's friend and advisor, Colonel Carlos E. Serrano, was himself connected to the drug traffic. As we learned from Professor Barry Carr, the prime purpose of the DFS was not to contain drug violence, but on the contrary, to manage it and unleash violence against the pro-communist left. Okay, so yeah, it was modeled on the FBI, engaged in telephone tapping with equipment provided by the FBI, employed FBI instructors on the training of 9 recruits, and conducted surveillance of, quote, dissident activities in the labor movement and on the left. And they say it is no coincidence that the attack on the headquarters of the Mexican Railways Workers Union in October 1948, the first successful attempt to crush a powerful union, was carried out by elements of the DFS under the personal command of Carlos Serrano. An anti-communist campaign was personally directed by Senator Carlos A. Serrano, a friend of Aleman. Interesting, that says the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City became split over the use of the DFS and drug traffickers as anti-communist assets. The State Department and military attaché denounced the DFS for its drug involvement, but the CIA did not. The drug trafficking of Carlos Serrano was mentioned in a confidential State Department report in 1947. They say he controlled marijuana trafficking in Mexico City. And the American military attaché, Maurice Holden, compared the DFS to the Gestapo because of the powers it had been given and the extremely dubious background of those persons recruited to form it. So yeah, all this was happening in the 40s. I will just skip down a little bit. Another chapter here. Did Howard Hunt come to Mexico because of drugs? Interesting. All right. A man widely reported to have been CIA station chief in 1950-51 is E. Howard Hunt, who later achieved notoriety for his role in the Watergate break-in. However, the Rockefeller Commission report, while confirming that Hunt served in the Mexico City CIA station in 50 and 51, denied that he had ever been station chief or acting station chief. Nevertheless, the CIA's favorable assessment of the drug traffickers raises the question of whether Hunt was the author. I guess, yeah, he had written a memo, I guess, up here that was like, it's chill. These guys are all good. I don't know. So we wonder if maybe Hunt was the author. Along with Paul Hellawell, shout out Castlebank, Hunt was a veteran of the Office of Strategic Services in Kunming, China, a station that had made payments to its agents in opium. And by 1949, if not earlier, Hellawell, by now an Office of Policy Coordination officer, engaged in purchasing civil air transport, the airline of General Claire Chennault, Chiang Kai-shek's ally for the CIA, was counsel to the money laundering bank of Meyer Lansky, mastermind of the U.S.-Mexican drug connection. Further research is needed to establish if Hunt was still part of the Hellawell cabal in government that in 1949-51 produced proprietaries for the OPC in Southeast Asia. Although Hunt had gone to Mexico on a Guggenheim Fellowship after the war. What did he get a Guggenheim Fellowship for?
I do not know. I'm curious.
I'd never heard that before. That is wild. Yeah, I'd forgotten actually that Hunt and Paul Hellawell actually. I don't want to say we undersold how sus Paul Hellawell was, but like he wasn't just like an OSS guy. Like this guy was so, I think he ended up running the Far East desk at the OSS by the end of the war, and I didn't realize he personally served in the same office with Hunt in China, and they were paying everybody in opium basically.
He received a Guggenheim Fellowship for his writing.
Wow, because he did write he wrote like spy novels, right?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
So sus.
Yeah,
wow. I mean, that's just like transparently
very
sus.
That's incredibly sus.
So like this China expert basically gets given a Guggenheim Fellowship to go to Mexico, even though as Scott notes here, his prior government experience was not with Latin America, but with the KMT and Yunnan. It is thus perhaps relevant that the KMT was involved in the domestic Mexican opium traffic through Chinese residents there. In 1946, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics reported that in a recent Kuomintang convention in Mexico City, a wide solicitation of funds for the future operation of the opium trade was noted. By the late 40s, according to Douglas Valentine, KMT opium was again reaching the U.S. via Mexico, thanks to the frequent trips to Mexico City of Bugsy Siegel's mistress, Virginia Hill. Hill ran a nightclub in Nuevo Laredo, directly across the border from Meltzer's base of operations in Laredo, Texas. On her trips to Mexico, Hill traveled with Dr. Margaret Chung, honorary member of the Hip Sing Tong in San Francisco and physician to the pilots of Chenault's wartime Flying Tigers in China. Lansky, who had pre-war KMT connections, appears to have overseen this operation since Virginia Hill moved to Mexico at Meyer Lansky's request and seduced a number of Mexico's, quote, top politicians, army officers, diplomats, and police officials. According to Harry Anslinger, Siegel and Virginia Hill also negotiated with Mexican politicians to finance poppy culture in the northwest part of the country. Damn, wow, everyone's busy in the early 50s. Jesus. Hunt, after returning to Mexico City in 1953, oh my God, created a Latin American branch there for the KMT's projected Anti-Communist League. I didn't realize, I've forgotten that he literally was like directly founded one of the branches. Its first incarnation, the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, APACL, was only started in 1954 by the KMT in alliance with South Korea, and Yoshio Kodama, a Japanese war criminal and suspected drug trafficker, released in 1950 to work with the CIA and U.S. General Willoughby. But Ting Tsuo Shu, an assistant to the KMT's drug trafficking General Lai Mai, I hope I'm saying that right, in Burma, was trying as early as 1952 to recruit Burmese tribal delegations to the proposed league. A Kachin contingent eventually did join. Hunt in 1954 assembled in Mexico City a continental cast of Mexican and other Latin American right-wingers in a political coalition calling for the ouster of President Arbenz in Guatemala. This group became a permanent participant in APACL conferences, and after 1966 in a larger World Anti-Communist League, the famous WACL. Hunt's Mexican chapter, in particular, came under the control of a group of anti-Semitic neo-fascists, the Tecos, who in the 1970s developed liaisons with right-wing death squads and included DFS agents in their circle. So now, okay, it's heating up. We're getting WACL. How about this for a next section title? Hunt, Klein, Singlab, Hellowell, Lansky, Donovan, a meta group? Question mark. And now we're going to talk about the Nazi cocaine coup. So OSS officers attached to the wartime station in Kunming, Hellowell, E. Howard Hunt, Ray Klein, Lucien Conain, and Mitch Warbell. Wow, like everybody was in this one station. Damn. Cast a long shadow over both post-war intelligence drug triarchies and WACL's history. In addition to Hellowell's support of the KMT drug traffickers in Burma and Hunt's contribution in Mexico, APACL's formation is said to have owed a large debt to Ray Klein. In the late 70s, John Singlaub, another veteran of Kunming, took over WACL. Lucien Conin became a case officer of the Vietnamese officials overseeing anti-communist drug networks. First, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and later police chief Nguyen Ngoc Loan. These are apologies, not doing those Vietnamese names well.
Yeah.
Mitchell Warbell III, who went on to develop small arms for intelligence services like the DFS, and I think was LaRouche's security for a while, right? There's a whole thing about him. Jimmy did a whole thing about him. Was also involved with WACL death squad patrons like Mario Sandoval Alarcón, and was himself eventually indicted on drug charges. Both in Asia and Latin America, WACL members have been repeatedly accused of drug trafficking-related activities. The most notorious of these was the so-called Bolivian cocaine coup of 1980, in which a leading drug trafficker, with WACL help, briefly installed his cousin as Minister of the Interior. Senate counsel Jack Blum has described the role in the coup of the U.S. and Argentina using local WACL assets. Quote, during the Carter administration, when human rights became a public priority, we quietly encouraged other countries to act as our proxy. The subcommittee took remarkable testimony from a former civilian employee of the Argentine military government, Leandro Sanchez Reis, who described their anti-communist efforts in detail. He told the subcommittee that the Argentine military was responsible for the so-called cocaine coup in Bolivia. He said the Argentine military intelligence people used the profits from their control of the Bolivian cocaine market to finance an anti-communist, quote, battalion, which operated all over the continent. He told the subcommittee that he set up a money laundering operation in Fort Lauderdale to provide funds for the covert battalion. He claimed that our government assisted his efforts. All right, let's put a note on that for later. Fort Lauderdale money laundering operation in the late 70s. All right. A related drug bust in Florida weeks before the coup ended with the release of the alleged trafficker, Jose Roberto Gasser, without charges. So, similarly, WACL members in Latin America, most notoriously Mario Sandoval Alarcón of Guatemala and Roberto Dalbizon of El Salvador, were responsible for developing a network of death squads in Central America. The former was rewarded with an invitation to Ronald Reagan's first inaugural. You know who else was there at the first inaugural? Licio Gelli, the head of the P2 Lodge.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think he was at both, actually. And we will find out why soon. Anyways, international drug trafficking becomes itself a form of social organization, which WACL, especially in Latin America, exploited. But the use of off-the-books drug assets against the left around the world dates back to covert U.S. policy in the 40s. In Marseille in 1947, the American unionist Irving Brown worked with the Guerini brothers of the Corsican Mafia to crush a communist dockers strike and thereby, quote, created the ideal environment for the growth of Marseille's heroin laboratories. The strike-breaking tactics in Marseille closely paralleled those of the DFS the same year. By 1951, if not earlier, Corsicans from Marseille, notably Paul Mondolini, were using Mexico City as a way station for their heroin to reach Montreal in New York. Their chief Mexican contact, Jorge Moreno Chauvet, described as the most important Mexican trafficker in 1964, had in his network an officer of the DFS, Captain Rafael Chavarri. Again in the same year, 1947, Wild Bill Donovan is said by an Italian authority to have financed the May Day massacre in Sicily, organized by the former Detroit mafia figure Frank Coppola. We checked, can't find any relation to Francis, but same name. And also from Detroit, both of them, in which 8 people were killed and 33 wounded. Frank Coppola had been recently deported to Italy, along with Lucky Luciano and more than 60 other American mafiosi, some of them allegedly on a U.S. Army plane. Most of them, including both Coppola and Luciano, became involved in high-level narcotics trafficking. One of them, the drug trafficker Silvestro Carolla of New Orleans, moved briefly to Acapulco in 1948 and is said to have helped Luciano establish, quote, criminal enterprises in Mexico. By the 1950s, there were thus triarchic power arrangements connecting local security forces, the drug traffic, and the CIA in other countries besides Mexico, most notably Cuba, Thailand, Vietnam, Lebanon, Italy, and eventually Turkey and Pakistan. The activities of Donovan in Italy and Thailand, Hellowell in Thailand and the Bahamas, Lansky and Hunt in Southeast Asia and Mexico, and Brown in France raise an important question. For years, I assumed that these cliques and cabals were just separate projections of CIA or U.S. parapolitical influence abroad, but now I see them as possibly something more, the first post-war metagroup, dominated by Lansky, Hellowell, and Donovan. This group was able to manipulate the resources of the drug traffic for its own ends, which were highly political, as well as, at least in Lansky's case, economic. At times, this metagroup seems to have had its own integrity and purpose, not reducible to the official goals of the U.S. government. Interesting. The metagroup. All right. All right. Let's see. I think he's cooking here.
Yeah. Did he define metagroup yet?
He's about to.
Right.
Well, he's about to get into it. He's going to talk about Wild Bill Donovan and the World Commerce Corporation.
Nice. Okay.
He goes on. Many have described the private and often well-connected intelligence networks that filled the gap between the closing down of OSS in 1944 and the formation of the CIA in 1947. Alan Block writes of the uncontrollable subculture of intelligence evolving in this period and, quote, the networks spinning from this subculture that were articulated by the extremely wealthy and well-connected and were not an intrinsic formal part of any government agency. So I think that's important. That's an important thing that he's going to get into, of like what happens when the ruling class are the people that set up the CIA. Then it sometimes can be a category error to be like, oh, like the CIA wanted to do this, when in fact it might be these silk toppers, these connected silk topper types enacting their will through these institutions, right? Like the CIA is really their puppet. But going on, Joseph Trento transmits the rumor at the time in Washington that Dulles, Alan Dulles, quote, was now running a private intelligence service out of an office at 44 Wall Street, using some of the biggest names in American business. In the same post-war period, the FBI had Donovan under surveillance, interesting, suspecting, quote, that he had taken some steps toward formation of an anti-communist intelligence service on the model of a private concern financed by oil and industries before the war.
Oof, yeah.
I wonder what they mean based on the model of a private concern financed by oil and industries before the war. I wonder which group which private concern that they're referring to, because there is one from World War One that was that very much fits the bill of that, called
brackets like on the model of is like hard to kind of like, what actually is that substituting for? Like, what was there originally?
I'm not sure.
Like, was there just a comma there? Like, it's like a Pinkerton type thing.
Yeah, I think it's kind of describing a Pinkerton type thing. And there was one group which I'd love to do an episode on one day, called the American Protective League, which is kind of based out of Chicago, run by some leading families from Chicago, let's put it that way, who were like a strike busting patriot private intelligence service that was like ambiguously sort of deputized by like either the Treasury or the Justice Department to go around. And then they kind of had like their, like, you would like pay money to be a member, and they would like mail you like your badge, and you would like go around like a vigilante, like, and it was ostensibly to root out like anti-war, like unpatriotic people, but also like anarchists and German sympathizers. But really what they did is like, I think they infamously, they were used as strike breakers, particularly I think against the IWW, but there's a lot of crazy shit with that. But that was a model, actually, I think it even influenced the early formation of the FBI. And of course, naturally, the Pinkertons as well, and other private outfits like that. But it's interesting that I guess J. Edgar Hoover was nervous about like
I hope that
having
this
a competitor.
Wasn't the law firm that my grandfather wasn't putting to join.
Yeah, I think he dodged a bullet there, literally.
He did turn it down. He turned it down. And I definitely believe that he turned it down due to the criterion of embarrassment, because my family would definitely brag about it if he hadn't turned it down. They would definitely all be proud of it. It wouldn't be something to like pretend wasn't true.
Right.
Yeah,
and and he wasn't he was in the Pacific, but I guess he wasn't a China head, so he didn't have.
He was in the Pacific in World War II, but as far as I know, he didn't have like any travel after that at all, which is in contrast to some people's, like a lot of people in that kind of milieu, and
but I guess Donovan, I don't know, up to something interesting shit here. So yeah, they were worried that the FBI may have focused in particular on Donovan's World Commerce Corporation, an early transnational firm formed by Donovan with a number of OSS hands and backed by leading capitalists like John Keswick of Jardine Matheson, Nelson Rockefeller, and John J. McCloy. Donovan's biographer, I think I might have that book, by the way, got it at the last bookstore, describes the WCC, whose leaders included the legendary William Stevenson of British intelligence, as a, quote, commercial intelligence service. We read some stuff from him, right? Didn't he write the book about Borman?
I honestly don't remember who wrote that book.
I feel like there was a guy who himself was a British spy who wrote like a book about Borman surviving World War II. But then it was weird as we went through it. I'll have to double check that. Anyways, undoubtedly it had its own agenda for promoting capitalism in the post-war era. The WCC also had links to the Kuomintang. Thus, in early 1950, a Panama-based subsidiary of the WCC, Commerce International (parentheses China), was supplying military arms and training to Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan in a period when Secretary of State Acheson was not yet permitting official U.S. support. Bruce Cummings suspects that CIC may well have been a CIA proprietary company, in which case it is relevant that the CIA station responsible for Panama was Mexico City, where Hunt was stationed. Donovan, in addition, had his own personal links to the Kuomintang. In late 1949, he led a successful legal fight to prevent China's civil air fleet in Hong Kong from falling into the hands of the new Chinese People's Republic, largely because Chiang Kai-shek's ally, General Claire Chennault, wanted the planes on Taiwan, quote, as part of his arsenal for attacking the mainland. Yikes. And in 1950, the WCC became involved in a complex manipulation of world soybean prices. What? From which the KMT also profited. Wow, soy. They were pushing soy on.
Folks.
Doing something, folks. They're doing something with soy. And it reminds me also of the Moonies getting involved in like sushi and like different food businesses around the world, right? Like using it for like dark death squad money laundering. Going on, in the light of subsequent developments in the global drug traffic, particularly in the 80s with BCCI, I suspect we should think of the first post-war metagroup, the overlapping global operations of Hunt, Donovan, Hallowell, and Lansky, as part of a historical succession of metagroups shaping U.S. governmental relations to the international drug traffic, often well before U.S. government approval had been secured for these policies. It is now generally acknowledged that the CIA, like the intelligence agencies of other great powers, has used drug traffickers as assets in virtually every continent of the globe. I once described this exploitation as an example of, quote, parapolitics, state covert actions and policies conducted, quote, not by rational debate and responsible decision-making, but by indirection, collusion, and deceit. Later, I situated the role of deliberate governmental direction in the larger arena of deep politics, the entire field of political practices and relationships, deliberate or not, which are usually concealed rather than acknowledged. So yeah, he's leaning into the hiddenness. Like it all hinges on he's focusing on hiddenness, which I think is good. So recently I have suspected that the realm of shadows may be even more complicated. The drug collaborations of Howard Hunt and other Kunming OSS veterans, one of whom, Paul Hallowell, must be counted part of Meyer Lansky's milieu, suggests a third level, still deeper and even less documented, in which systematic conscious direction was coming from outside lawfully constituted government. We can call this non-state parapolitics, actions and policies which are deliberate, but which are determined by groups and agencies beyond the reach of the domestic state. Evidence for this hypothesis is very sketchy. One can, however, point to the arrival in Mexico of Mondolini and Carolla, both associated with Luciano, shortly after an international, quote, roof or protection for their activities had been established through various agencies, including the DFS. So I don't know. Whoa there, Peter Dale Scott. Hold on there, Chief. It sounds like he's gesturing at a grand conspiracy theory a little bit, but no, I'm being a little facetious. But he's leaving the door open. I respect that, honestly. I respect that he's leaving the door open that there might be a third level, still deeper and even less documented, in which systematic conscious direction it does come that trickles down to these metagroups, right? Because I think he's right that sometimes, again and again, like it's one thing, and I think sometimes like maybe a kind of democratic socialist, kind of analysis would point out that, all these like deep political events, well, of course, they'll believe the CIA did that. But it's just a function of, it's like an automatic function of like what they do to like support U.S. interests. But from time to time, there are things that happen that like I don't know, they really don't feel like they're even in like America's most cynical national interest, or if they are, they're for the interest of a very, very tiny elite of people that like benefit from it, and or there's like some other orthogonal motive that they're striving towards, like some other secret agenda, like plan that and the cover, the plan covering it is kind of like a big misdirection and excuse, right, to do it. I mean, it's like I can't rule that out. And of course, then right, like it's very vague once you get into this level, like who's that group, like because it would have to be a group, right? It would have to be a conscious group. Is it the old aristocracy of Europe? Is it Bilderberg Group? Is it Bohemian Grove? We've looked at a lot of these groups, and I can't say that, oh yeah, that's probably the group. In fact, I mean, it is possible that like the true group that is that group is one that like nobody knows about because it's secret. Like it's almost funny to think of like that, the people in the kind of the ruling class or whatever in this world could do all these crazy things, but sometimes maybe we fail to consider that they could have an entire group or conference or something like that they can, at least for a while, keep completely secret from like any mention of it appearing in the public or something. Like it's not the hardest thing to do with like enough and I'm sure with like all the Silicon Valley weird like new age cult like sex parties and shit like that, like I'm sure little things like that happen all the time that, you know,
Yes.
you can't Google this and like look it up. Like, oh, it's like you have to be kind of in that world
Yeah.
to like know about it. And is there something that could be on that powerful of level that even people like lower down in the food chain
I mean,
like
like,
don't know of its
I
existence?
don't think that there's like any like I don't think there's even any like certainly I don't think there's one group that is like, incredibly powerful, and I don't think that's what you're even saying, but
No,
like,
no.
and it controls everything, like in the way people think of like the Bilderberg group or think about the Bohemian Grove or think about like whatever group, the Illuminati or like whatever
Mhm.
group they imagine like controls everything or is like the most powerful group. But I mean, I do think that like definitely like secret groups that like aren't like widely known the way the Bilderberg group or the Bohemian Grove is, or secret societies that like are actually a secret, right?
Mhm.
Not just that like what they do is secret or their rights are putatively secret or things like that. Certainly those groups do exist. And also like I think that like outside of like official groups, like a now call to order the meeting of like the sacred, like the order of the sacred moose or whatever, like people just like yeah, like you said, like at like, sex parties or like parties of any nature, right? Like they
Mhm.
like gather like in certain cliques and groups that
Mhm.
are more like informal and like where they have shared values and like shared conversations,
Right, right.
like
Like, I'm sure the weird orgies in the Hamptons with a bunch of billionaires and, like, you know, I'm sure Diddy's parties, remember, you know, that's all getting
yeah,
aired
the
out
all white
now, but the
parties.
all-white
Yeah.
parties, like,
Yeah.
yeah, somebody told me years ago he's the devil, and I believe it. But yeah, yeah, so I think, you know, yeah, it's not so much that, like, there's one cabal get-together every year where, like, they decide everything, but I think
Yeah.
all of these things kind of serve a little bit of a coordinative function, like going to Davos, going to Bohemian Grove, going to this thing, like going to Jackson
Yeah.
Hole. Like all these things are like, oh, you hit the circuit, you see the other powerful people, you get to catch
Yes.
up with them, kind of like coordinate and like touch base and get a sense of like where, and you generally people tend to kind of move like definitely like I feel like
Yeah. I mean,
the
if I like
EU in America right now they kind of move in lockstep with each other.
I mean, like, it's kind of like, again, like, I don't want to extrapolate, like, it kind of reminds me of the Carl Oglesby thing of like, everyone can imagine a conspiracy, like, at the level of like, their industry or like the field that they work in. But
Right,
then
right,
once it's like one step higher, it somehow becomes insane to contemplate. But it kind
right.
of like what you're talking about kind of reminds me of like academic conferences. Like to be in an academic field, like you go, like, to really be like out there as a mover and shaker, you want to hit like all the main circuit like all the main conferences like that year, like if you're in if you're in performance studies, right, you want to go to
Hmm.
the American Society for Theater Research, you want to go to the Association of Theater and Higher Education, you want to go to maybe even Forum Studies International, right, like so like and if you're in a different field, like if you're in like Islamic studies or like you might go to the Middle East Studies Association, MESA, you might go to IJME. I don't even know that. I don't forget that's all he stands for. The International Journal of Middle East Studies. You might go
Uh-huh.
to the American Oriental Society, which still hasn't changed its name, but
Wow.
I hear they are
Okay.
thinking
Any
of
day
one
now.
finally. Yeah, but like, and all the same people are at all those different conferences, right? Maybe there's some people who are different, but a lot of them are the same, right?
Hmm.
And like, there's like a theme, and like you can see like what it's like to get a pulse of like the field, what everyone's talking about, right? And
Hmm.
like people are all like kind of like they gather and they meet like in groups and they talk, and I mean Davos literally is like a conference like that, but like
Yeah.
there's also like other like things like that, like I think of that story about
The
like the
Edge conferences back in the day, right? The
yeah,
Epstein Edge
or
conferences.
yeah, things like that, right? And
Hmm.
like there's a million different examples, and I yeah, like and so like but their thing isn't like, what's going on in our new academic field, like what's hot right now, what topics are hot right now, like, what like new buzzwords are there. But
Hmm.
like I mean, it is like what new buzzwords are there, but their business isn't just like writing a bunch of papers and teaching students. It's like running the entire world, like literally.
Yeah.
And like they know it too. Like, do you think Elon
And
doesn't
like
know that
doing
he like
2CB with Bobby Weir, but like that's just, you know, a fun side part of the whole thing, you know.
well, that's like kind
Gotta
of
do some
part of
research
it,
chemicals with I mean,
that's
yeah, talk about in-group bonding, right? You
well,
know.
I actually remember being at an academic conference like a while ago, and like at
Mhm.
one of the big plenary talks, like the guy was like, one of the speakers was like talking about how he was like, when I was young, I regretted my experimentation with psychedelics because, I felt that they had like impaired my ability to think analytically. But now, like as an adult, like I'm happy to have done that because like I think that it like helps me to like so it's interesting. Yeah, like so those things like do have like, this guy was like, speaking to like addressing the whole conference kind of like in a plenary is like saying like, oh, if you take psychedelics, it's gonna help you think. This is like kind of like, I'm not saying there's a one-to-one comparison between these things, but like memes do circulate like in certain groups. So you can like draw a compare like, and like within social groups and within like larger communities.
People like to
And
get inebriated at large get-togethers, like conferences,
yeah,
camp
or
retreats,
like
whatever.
and
They like to
also
get
like
loaded.
little like when people like we joke like, oh, a memo went out about this.
Mhm.
Maybe a memo didn't go out, but like a text went out or like an email went out
The
or
group
like,
chat was talking about
the
it.
group chat was talking about it or like people were saying it at this event. And like or at this like like and like they like people who are that powerful know how powerful they are. Like they know that like Elon is a extreme example, but like,
Right.
he definitely knows like how powerful he is,
Mhm.
right? Like he's not under any illusions that he's not powerful. Like
I mean, he might
and
be under
and
illusions that he's like, kind of like a god or something. Like he might have a little overestimation of like how truly powerful, but he's definitely powerful.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess the delusions would be in the opposite direction. I guess, yeah. But yeah, I guess that's true. They may have delusions of being more powerful than they are,
Right.
or like being more untouchable than they are. But they certainly don't underestimate. What I'm saying is like it's not like they don't realize that like their decisions have a huge influence on like the operation of like the world and on other people, in a huge way. And like they're trying to figure out how to do that in line with their values that often are incredibly warped and like satanic yet again. Maybe
Mhm.
not like they're literally like wearing black robes and well, definitely not. They're not wearing black robes and worshiping the devil, for the most part.
They're wearing
However,
judge
like
robes.
yeah, however, they're,
Reifying neoliberalism.
they're satanic in the broad sense,
Hmm.
which like I think everyone understands what I mean.
Right.
So
Right.
like and they like and part of that like sort of group bonding is like sharing those views and like, accept it like that's like the whole that element of like that's why like the teal thing isn't so like insane, like even though like it's kind of stupid and goofy when you think of like, oh, like why is he like trying to like infiltrate like Dime Square or whatever, like maybe like it seems
Right.
like silly, like why is he trying, like why is he running these people like Moldbug or whatever, like
Hmm.
but that like the Moldbug like seduction idea of like dark elves,
Yeah.
like that does work. Like I hate to say it, but it does work.
Especially in a
Like
place like Manhattan, like
yeah,
definitely where a lot of people
like
like already kind of see themselves as like
what
the
is
the
cool.
dark elves.
I was just saying the other day that like it's amazing how like I was reading an article just like a human interest is like a very stupid human interest story actually in like in WAPO of all
Hmm.
places. Like I just like randomly came across this. It was about someone who's trying to overcome their PTSD from being shot by going to the gun range. So it was a very but so it's completely irrelevant to everything and it was like not a very good piece. However, the the guy mentioned like when I was young, like
Hmm.
in the 80s, like everyone was rah rah Reagan, so I was like an NRA member, like I like was into all that stuff, and I'm like it's very interesting how like everyone kind of has this idea that like they're being like kind of countercultural and subversive, like when like really like they're adopting, like for instance when Obama was president, that was like the golden age of like what people now call like, which I hate to talk about, but like wokeness or like the SJWs or whatever, like
Uh-huh.
it's that was like the sort of heyday of that, where that like was kind of like it was cool to be like socially conscious and like quote unquote woke in that way, like
And
that's
like
what
in the
people kind of mean
2010s.
when they say woke, like the cool what was cool during the Obama era, then like when Trump came to office, like now it's kind of weirdly cool in the eyes of some,
Oh yeah,
to be like a
it's
white
like
supremacist
rebellious
fascist.
or
And
just,
but
trigger people, just
yeah,
like
but
that. I
really
don't know.
like these aren't like subversive at all. They're just like obviously really popular. And like in fact like having like a resurgence and like a wave of popularity. And then but it's very weird how people like kind of imagine that these things are subversive in some way, you know? Like obviously, like, I'm not saying there's any comparison between like being like anti-racist and being racist at all. I'm just saying that it's interesting, like how people kind of imagine that there's like
Well,
a,
I think
a subversion of these things, or like kind of
that was what was like tapped into, is like, oh, like pivoting and the end of the first Trump term to like, and during COVID, towards like, what if we stop being like PC basically, which also I think kind of happened in the 90s when there was like a little bit of
yeah.
the first wave of like political correctness, and then like Bill Maher had a show, it's like politically incorrect, fuck you, and then like I feel like the mid to late 90s, early 2000s was like a backlash era, and then maybe around the time Obama
It's
came
kind of like
in,
how, yeah.
it
Sorry,
started
yeah.
swinging back like in another direction.
It's kind of like
And
how the hippie counterculture was like completely like, limb hang, like CIA run thing. And then like punk was like totally like Reaganite and fascist, and all these like
yeah,
kind of like countercultures and like subversive things are actually like it's not like totally like contained. And actually like
that's
completely
kind of what I
managed.
feel like. These
Like,
identities were kind of like pre-crafted for people to glom onto and then fight in a way that
yeah.
like that keeps them like kind of contained in this
But
little like
yeah.
discursive culture war.
Yeah, but I guess my point is that even though people like, for whatever reason have this like strong a strong attachment. I don't know, maybe it's an American thing, maybe it's just a broader thing. They have a strong idea to like being an individual who is like going against the establishment. They are very susceptible to being like influenced by what seems cool. And I think like maybe there's this equation between like what people are acting like is cool and what's like
Yeah.
anti-establishment, even if that thing is totally like, reactionary, even like the oldest, thing in the world, or just like, yeah, so
Yeah.
that's that, like
You saw that in the
you can see
2000s
why.
kind of, actually, with like the appropriation of like trucker hats as being like a hipster, like all these like kind of like Midwestern, like Southern, like working class, like kind of white, like poor white kind of like things that were coded as like rural poor white, like got adopted by like city hipsters as I
Yeah, I
don't
vaguely
know,
remember this. Yeah.
there's a kind of thing. But
Yeah, I mean it's obviously a complex phenomenon, but like and there's like there's more to say about that, but like I guess my point is that like it's I mean, kind of a trivial and pedestrian point, but like it's incredibly easy to influence people like by like, and to manage,
especially when you own a
you know.
company like Palantir. Like that's the other
Yeah.
thing, that just because like all you see is him like sponsoring dumb moldbug parties at Sovereign House or whatever the fuck, like doesn't mean that he's not running like analytics on like, how do I manipulate like an entire scene of people, or thousands of
Yeah.
people online like at scale, because like he can spot, like he's almost like uniquely well situated as a private citizen to be able to spy on all of us, which is something you
Yes.
always have to like keep in mind with like Peter Thiel, that he has like a private intelligence like surveillance company that works with all the military CIA cop people, and he's like a fascist Zionist, like definitely grandchild of Nazis, sorry, speculatively, but like come on, can never find what his grandparents did, etc. And so yeah, like it's not something, it's like I sort of, I understand why people would have the impulse to like, let's kind of diffuse him by laughing at how wacky like this is and how he's like gonna
Yeah.
fail, because like none of these people are having a normal one, etc. But I don't know, it's still kind of sus, like it's
Well,
it's
yeah,
a very
the idea.
deliberate kind of thing. It's very influence the influencers kind of vibes, as we've like talked
Right.
about
The
before,
idea
right?
of like influencing people by, which is why I, speaking getting to in the on the meta level, that's why like I'm happy when people like call us dorks or goofballs, because like,
I'm okay with
what a
that.
lot of people think is cool is evil. And I like, so like good.
Nerds,
I'm
yeah,
happy to
yeah,
be like a nerd, a dork, and a goofball.
yeah.
Or whatever the hell,
Instead of
like
being a bad boy.
yeah. But yeah, like yeah, not Peck's bad boy or whatever. So my point is that like what's very cool is very powerful, and like these people recognize that they have like a outside ability to do that, and it's based on their own experiences in their own peer group, where like they can
Right.
kind of establish norms, and then they see how they can do that, and then they want to extrapolate that process further or bring people into their peer group in order to manipulate them.
You know, if we ever do another episode where we just decide to destabilize a term, it might be interesting to do an episode where we destabilize the term cool and like also trace like where did it come from and like
Yeah.
because like we all know what it means, but it has such a power to it. And also
Yeah.
a power that can be like abused, right?
Yeah.
Where, oh no, like that's cool. That person's cool, or like that thing is just cool. I just think it's cool. And like, I mean,
Yeah.
I use it. I'm not immune from like saying, oh, that's
Right.
cool, you know, but like it, but the idea of coolness is like a branding thing and the aura of coolness and how it can kind of like short circuit or like it can like run a kind of shortcut of like maybe more like rational or critical thinking about something and just like do an end run around it and you're just like, oh damn, that's cool, you know, and you don't like think about it too hard and you just want to enjoy it, you know, and that kind of thing. Like it shuts off, it casts a little bit of a spell, like just a little bit of a spell. I mean, sometimes a big one, but like I always a little spell when, you know, I mean,
yeah.
And to be like to feel cool, to be called cool, like all these other things, like, you know, to think somebody's cool. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting, but maybe it needs to be destabilized because for some, sometimes I see it as like, yeah, it's like this amorphous kind of excuse for somebody who's like bad, but like, hey man, they're cool. And I feel like being bad and being cool are different things. And like, I mean, if you're truly bad, you're not cool, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's a huge thing in our culture, especially from probably like from the 60s onward. Like they kind of started it, the rock stars and the rebellious movie stars and all that kind of stuff of like, even James Dean or Elvis, you could say, because they were kind of bad boys, right? Even Peck's bad boy. So there's actually there's a long lineage of, you know, like association of the bad boy is cool. Like everybody knows the bad boy is cool, right? Fonzie,
Yeah,
I mean,
of course.
he's a little sad and weird, but like in general, generally speaking, like the bad boys are cool. And like, I think there's a lot of marketing and like consumerist things that have like really like hardcore reinforced that thing, you know, reinforced that like mentality, especially in the late 20th century.
I wanna
I just wanted to, I don't know if there's anything else in this Peter Del Scott article. I did want to flag, so far I'm loving this. I think it's great overall. You know, he's even gesturing at a third shadow layer that we can barely define, but he has a suspicion that it's there. And he's dropping hard facts. I feel like it's good. You know, he talks about like the early 90s and like the wealth inequality, like the result of all this shit is basically that Mexico has like some of the biggest gap between rich and poor, as like I guess at the time of this writing, the seventh largest gap in the world. And a lot of that has to do with like money laundering and like the government being directly in bed with like drug traffickers, and also embracing like neoliberal Milton Friedman economics. But I will flag a little bit here. You know, he says, all right, one quote, you know, drug production is linked to poverty because it's driven in large measure by the failing agricultural economy and lack of reasonable alternatives for much of the impoverished rural populace. And second, the growing drug industry brings along with it a number of important, quote, negative externalities such as violence, corruption, inter and intra-community conflict, and a culture of operating outside the law and the formal economy, which all work strongly against the creation of long-term sustainable economic growth. Drug production and poverty are mutually reinforcing. Poverty and the lack of economic alternatives motivate drug production, and drug production in turn perpetuates poverty and limits the creation of economic alternatives. He says another factor in Mexican poverty is the economic, quote, liberalization pushed on Mexico and the rest of the world by market fundamentalism of the so-called Washington Consensus. This package of trade liberalization, fiscal stability, privatization, and free capital flows is, in truth, hardly a consensus. In its empirical phase, the monetarist theory of Milton Friedman at the U of Chicago was a corrective to fiscal Keynesianism, which, when overapplied in inappropriate situations, had led to inflation. But it was not long before the neoliberalism of the Chicago School had become an overapplied ideology in turn. This was thanks to the intervention of the U.S. government, anxious to use Friedman's doctrines to pry open foreign markets for U.S. investment. Today there is an interesting new consensus that the ideas of market fundamentalism, far from solving the problems of developing countries, aggravated them. Well, I mean, Amy Chua, who wants to work for a U.S. bank on a Mexican privatization project, is part of this new consensus. She has blamed the increase of poverty in the 1990s on this American promotion of what she called, quote, laissez-faire capitalism, a form of markets that the West abandoned long ago. She criticized the U.S. and IMF campaign for freeing markets from government regulation as a campaign that, quote, rarely includes any significant redistributive mechanisms, despite the fact that, as Jorge Castañeda has commented, if democracy does not coincide with growth and with redistribution, in all likelihood, it will not last in Latin America. Actually, laissez-faire is too kind a term. Crony capitalism would appear to better describe what we have usually seen. Government-assisted globalization that at home favors the cronies, such as Halliburton and Enron, of whatever government is in Washington, and also at the receiving end favors the cronies of the recipient government. Well, yeah, I'm going to throw a yellow flag on the field for that one, because I think, you know, he wrote this in the 2000s. Now I feel like the term crony capitalism, I kind of recoil when I see it, because it's like a kind of libertarian thing, right? It's pretty well coded as like this libertarian. And, you know, it presupposes that there's a not crony capitalism. Like there's a good capitalism. There's a pure, I think like RFK Jr. taught like crony capitalism. Like, you know, he goes off about it. And that's always like a little bit of a red flag for me. I don't think Peter Del Scott, I think he's just trying to use, you know, it's alliterative, and it was probably a trendy term in the late 2000s. And it's fine, but that's an example of where I would say like I wish he was like a little bit more of like just like a angry like Marxist, you know, instead of kind of like like every form of capitalism that I'm exploring in detail here is like completely evil and satanic and bad and all these other things, but like I'm gonna call this crony capitalism. And it's like, I don't know, like I think he, you know, he's relatively anti-capitalist, but like I think he could, you know, we could go harder in our analysis by saying, because it's not just Halliburton and Enron, it's not just the special interests like doing their favors. Like this is much more of an integrated system. So it's like, it's not like, oh, these guys are violating the rules of the capitalism game just a little bit, like they're cheating a little bit here and there, and that's how the situation's gotten so bad. It's like, I feel like his general argument is that this is all very like essential and, has always been there. He says that, this crony capitalism dynamic is very true of Mexico, where 12 billionaires, the so-called Mexican 12, were enriched by President Salinas's program, which is actually a product of the Washington Consensus of directed deregulation and selective liberalization. According to Elizabeth Carroll, the U.S. State Department, some of the businesses privatized were, quote, snapped up by traffickers in order to launder and invest the profits from their drug operations. The lack of controls over capital movements, another feature of the liberalization pushed by Washington, was a major factor in the impoverishment of the majority. In the case of Mexico, there was massive withdrawal of foreign and domestic capital in December 1994, leading to an estimated $70 billion loss in the stock market value of Mexican corporations, an avalanche of bankruptcies, and nearly 1 million layoffs over the next 12 months. Jesus. And so there was massive capital flight. He says that the most reasonable explanation for this capital flight is that cronies, both inside and outside the country, are protecting their recent acquisitions in Mexico by translating them into secure dollar assets. Not just in Mexico, but all over the world, one sees this pattern. Too often, U.S. IMF-enforced liberalization benefits not the nation, but a crony elite. Those who, of all the elements in the local economy, are the most likely to recycle their earnings back to the U.S. as soon as their crony status is threatened. It makes more sense to say that in such cases, the effect of these liberalization reforms is to strengthen U.S. relations with crony elites through the world rather than with market societies. Well, I mean, I see it as one and the same. Like they want like market societies around the world, but also they want crony elites like in charge of it. And they're like willing to destroy countries also if they just want to like steal the resources or whatever. Apparently, interesting here. He says it also makes more sense to blame the outflows on U.S. banks who continue to facilitate, indeed to encourage, massive movements of foreign flight capital into their own accounts. Often they do this by setting up private banks for this very purpose, sometimes in offshore tax havens. As Christian Science Monitor reported in 1996, recently it was disclosed how Citibank helped Raul Salinas de Gortari, brother of the former president, to hide a fortune in safe havens. CBS's 60 Minutes said that the hidden assets could be worth more than $300 million. The Salinas Citibank scandal attracted unusual attention because almost certainly some of the funds involved were from payoffs by Mexican drug lords. Wow, it even says a more flagrant example was Lehman Brothers, their frenzied activity on behalf of the Mexican regional governor, Mario Villanueva Madrid, as he fled into hiding after becoming the target of a drug and racketeering investigation. For this, a Lehman Brothers employee was indicted, but in the end, the firm itself was not. That's interesting because didn't Lehman Brothers start the 2008 financial crisis by collapsing? I think there was another essay we didn't get to in here that, posits the causal link perhaps between drug money laundering and large financial crises. And, they use, I think Mexico, they use Japan as examples of this. And I think Thailand as well, where sometimes it can have this hot money can have like a systemic effect. And sometimes I do wonder if the end of those 8 years of Bush that I don't know, there's so much financial fraud going on Wall Street. You know what I'm saying? And there was that interesting 9/11 collateral damage essay that was written that it's so weird that nobody else has ever really like taken it up in depth and tried to flesh out that theory a little bit. But like the second part of that theory was that the 2008 crisis was somehow connected to like whatever securities fraud thing on 9/11 occurred or something like that they were using the mortgage-backed securities and all that stuff, and basically that like the kind of like the Big Short like kind of version of the 2008 like financial crisis was probably similar to Enron and the savings and loan crisis in the 80s, like probably a cover story for like perhaps unintended consequences of like flooding the system with tons of like laundered drug money, right? And then maybe doing it using these like institutions and creating just sort of a frenzied environment I also wonder how much of it was kind of trying to just like make it look like the US was like invincible and capitalism was like winning and like look how fucking like successful we are, you know, in like kind of early to mid 80s when they're trying to like flex on the Soviets and like you'll never keep up with like our innovation and capitalism, blah blah blah. But then even by like, you know, 87, 88, they had like a recession and shit like that. But then by then it was too late because Corby was already doing his bullshit. Anyways, that's pretty much, you know, he talks about Banamex, one of the banks in the Salinas Circle, which has U.S. protection. Two Banamex senior officials were indicted in the U.S. in May 1998 as a result of Operation Casablanca, which U.S. Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin called, quote, the largest, most comprehensive drug money laundering case in the history of U.S. law enforcement in a mock Nevada casino that had, in fact, been specially created for a U.S. customs sting. They and 10 other senior Mexican bankers had, quote, avidly discussed how to handle the latest $500 million in drug proceeds already on hand. The Federal Reserve Board also seized $3.8 million from Banamex as a corporation. Citicorp subsequently purchased Banamex, and the Casablanca prosecutions collapsed. Okay, sick. All right, yeah. So these guys are like basically, yeah, drug traffickers, and then one of their sons slash nephews founded an NXIVM branch, etc. I don't think they went to jail, but anyways, I think we can leave. That's pretty much the end of the Peter Dale Scott. So what do we think about that overall? You know, I think we didn't have a lot of red flags on it. I don't think.
No, I thought it was pretty. You know, I think it was pretty good. Yeah, I was. You know, I was definitely intrigued. You know, and I think that I mean, yeah, like this is like a totally interesting and like valuable essay, and I don't even think that like the concept of parapolitics mattered for this at all. Nor did I think it even came up.
He did bring up parapolitics. He brought up parapolitics and deep politics at one point and kind of summarized like what he had said earlier about how I used to call this all parapolitics, but now, you know, I basically prefer to use the term deep history. Like this is a sort of an aspect of deep history, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I can understand. Like I kind of agree with that. And you know, he kind of introduces, maybe for the first time, but his sort of concept of the meta group, you know.
All right, yeah, he does say in this paragraph, I once described this exploitation as an example of parapolitics. Yeah, right.
Right. So, you know,
yeah,
he did move beyond it. And I feel how are we feeling about deep politics as you know, a label? Because I think we've talked a lot about parapolitics, but I know we like it better.
Okay.
But
I mean, I remember when we were first coming up. Well, I'm definitely okay enough with it for it to be used like in our little like branding thing, because I remember like when we were first coming up with that, like it didn't like, you know, jump out at me. It's like, all right, like I don't know about this, like, because I think again, what I like about deep politics is it doesn't seem like a term of art really. It just seems like, you know, politics is a deep subject. Politics is a deep thing. You know, it's a.
I also I feel like it's very easy to attach the deep politics of blank. Whereas to say like the parapolitics of blank sounds a little more weird and not as natural.
That's true. And I also think like the one thing about deep politics is that like, you know, it like kind of, I think some people are like, oh, like are like the deep state or whatever, which, you know, I feel like is one component of it. You know, certainly falls under the umbrella of deep politics, but
I guess, you know, at the end of the day, it's still all politics. It's just that's the portion of politics which is concealed, I think, is maybe. Like that holds up pretty strongly as a category because
it's kind of like if you say deep time is still time, you know, like,
right? A deep something
just because it's time. Paratime, I don't know what paratime is, you know.
Para is placing it somewhere else.
It sounds like it sounds like an alternate timeline. If I were to say like paratemporality, it would seem like something, but I don't think anyone has ever used the term paratemporality. Nor I feel like there's a temporality.
We haven't had time to use it yet, or you know, the opportunity to use it yet.
I don't think you know.
But yeah. I mean, I think I wonder if Peter Dale has written about who like he says the first post-war meta group, but I wonder how many other meta groups he has sort of sketched out. And one question that's always like nagged on me a little bit is like sort of, you know, who is the main meta group today? Because it's somewhat easier to trace people up through like the 80s and early 90s, like the sort of Iran Contra gang, right? And this earlier Hallowell, Donovan, Lansky people, but then it's hard to tell, like, and then the connections between them, like was Eric Prince kind of one, but on like the weird Wackel. He definitely feels like a modern day Wackel guy. So does Mike Flynn. They're a little easier to pin down, but the kind of the more like lib ones, I think we know who the public faces of it are. Like people like Samantha Power probably, or Victoria Nuland, Anthony Blinken, definitely. We're gonna get to him and some of his family history in Contra 8 next, which will be exciting. But I think we're like well equipped going back into Contra 8, having just taking some time to like explore the meta of a little bit of it, before we go deeper. But we're gonna get into some. I'm very excited about what we're about to like dig up for that. Call it Parapolitical if you want to. But, it's actually no. We're gonna move forward in time. We're gonna move a little forward in time to like the 1990s, and once again, the sequel, Alan Bloch's sequel, kind of to Masters of Paradise, is gonna get into some really really interesting territory. There's actually so many. I did all the notes on. I read this entire book when we were prepping Contra 7, and I think I spent like days just like, I'm looking through it now. Jesus, I took so many notes on this book, and I was just like bolding like everything and like looking up. God, all these trusts I looked up. Jesus, there's so much good stuff that I think we're just gonna really primarily focus on this one book this time, so it doesn't turn into a 5-parter. But and it gives us a good it re-summarizes a lot of the good stuff that we covered in Contra 7 about Castle Bank, because very much, in the mix, tight with all these people, and Mr. Bruce Rappaport, that's probably going to be our main guy, and some things that happen in Russia and all around the world. Wow, it's also, I think it's going to tap a little into the upcoming, or maybe already coming out, Demon Forces, depending on when we get this out. But it's all connected. So any final thoughts? Because I think we're gonna go back into action mode after this. I don't think we're gonna talk that much about our reflections upon the work that we do. So speak now or forever hold your peace, because we're going back in a hard mode after this. I mean, you can say whatever you want. It's your podcast, but
right. Yeah. I mean, I think that we covered it well enough. I don't think that there's any more I want to say about that. Again, we usually don't really talk about it. In fact, I don't really like talking about it because I don't know. I just feel like I'm allergic to that type of thing. I just feel like I'm very because in order to defend it from attacks, you kind of have to
believe in it, or
you kind of have to talk it up, and I don't really like to do anything. I do like to let it speak for itself, which is what I generally prefer to do. And that's kind of why even though we did do a little bit of that in this series of episodes, because as you said, it's our podcast, we can do whatever we want. If we want to complain about things that annoy us, we can complain about them on the podcast, and you guys have to listen to it. But I generally feel how I imagine others feel, which is that that's not necessarily the most interesting thing, which is why I thought
right.
I definitely that's why I'd rather talk about the sort of the history of the term parapolitics and do something kind of productive or interesting, rather than just be well, this isn't true because this is this, because you can't really do anything about that. But I thought it was, it's also kind of a fitting time as we kind of get towards the proper 200th episode, as I said, or the
proper 200,
the numerical 200th episode, not the not technically the 200th episode, but the numerical 200th. Yeah. So just kind of just check in, reflect a little bit on the project of SJ, and what's good, what some responses have been, and I'm sure those things will come through at various points in the future as they have in the past. But as for now, I mean, I agree with what you said, that I prefer to just let what we do speak for itself, which I think for the most part it does.
The SJ method.
Yeah, I feel like it comes through our work, definitely. I think for the most part, it doesn't need explanation or justification. We during the first part, we talked a little bit about some extra podcast issues that I did feel like, like were borderline where like, an explanation is fair enough for some of those things, especially when you have people kind of flinging bad faith innuendo who themselves, like, if they had to like be under the spotlight that we're under, they wouldn't like, do any better. And we know that for a fact.
Right.
But
I think we're gonna put our heads back down and hustle, and
like it's kind of funny because like now, like, we were annoyed about it and felt that, and I still think, it's definitely worth doing, but now I feel like that whole thing kind of almost has resolved itself and we don't want to return to it.
Nature is healed.
Yeah,
I think we had a nice purgative a couple episodes, but I think we're ready now to go back.
Yeah, it was nice to play back because also, like we talked about, it's kind of like a betrayal in a way, and like it's kind of hurtful. Like it's like a personal thing, and like and like I didn't like not a betrayal by the people who were concerned about some of the things that were brought up for misunderstanding them because they were presented dishonestly, but like a betrayal by the person who did this.
The squirrel busters who were coming at us. Yeah.
So it's kind of annoying in that way, and it's just kind of like one thing I'll say. I think we should end, but like one thing I'll say is that I do think I am happy, and I'm like again, this is why I am allergic to this type of thing, because I have to say like I'm proud of this, and I hate saying I'm proud of things, and I almost never feel proud, even though I think maybe that's unhealthy in a way too. But I am proud that like we did like not just ignore the criticism that we faced like now and in the past. I like that I am it's something that I value to actually like listen to what people say, like even if it's people who are saying it in a cruel way or something. Like I try to
metabolize these
and do try to adapt and do try to hear like the legitimate like feelings or concerns that might be behind that type of thing. And I think that's I think that the smart thing to do, like from like a podcast business angle, is to just like ignore
right.
But I think like I don't care about that, and I do like that we talk about it.
Say what you want about us, but we've never done the completely normal thing. We've never had a completely normal one, Chief. That's okay. We're actually happy that way. That's how we like to do it. So we're gonna be coming in hot after this. We got resume part half 2 of The Land Belongs to Whom It Belongs.
I'm looking forward to that soon. Very much.
That's gonna be good. Very necessary for right now, and probably continue. The Secret Machine music. We'll pick that up again soon. And Contra 8's gonna be just a nutritious like 4 hours of susness. Like there's gonna be, I'm excited for what new like things we can kind of stitch together of like maybe some new connections from Alan Block's work. Maybe I should just leave us with a little teaser that is a letter that was sent in the autumn of 1996 from Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Antigua and Barbuda, head of the Commonwealth. And it is titled to His Excellency, Mr. B.N. Yeltsin, President of the Russian Federation, the following. Being desirous of making provision for the representation in the Russian Federation on the interest of Antigua and Barbuda, we have made choice of our trusty and well-beloved Dr. Bruce Rappaport to reside with you in the character of our ambassador, extraordinary and plenipotentiary for Antigua and Barbuda. The missive was signed, your good friend, Elizabeth R. I'll leave it there. But, her good friend, Dr. Bruce Rappaport, the Queen of England, and Yeltsin. That's a little bit of what you can expect. But I guess we'll hang it up there for now. But until next time, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Yeah.
Bye.